On the evening of the 11th of March, 1974, a 22-year-old woman named Barbara Rocky was sitting at the desk in her bedroom in Provo, Utah. She was a junior at Brigham Young University, or BYU, and she was writing a letter. She wrote for a while, then she would stop, and she'd read over what she'd written. She wanted the words to be just right. After a few minutes, she wasn't quite satisfied, so she picked up her pen and added a few more lines. This letter was for her 7 roommates, and it was important that she get the tone exactly right, because in this letter, Barbara was telling them she was leaving. She was saying goodbye. Barbara was a student at BYU, which is a very religious university where the vast majority of students are practicing Mormons. But Barbara herself was not a Mormon. She had actually chosen to go to BYU because she was fascinated by religion. She thought that attending a school that was so deeply structured around faith would be a really interesting and unique experience. But as soon as she arrived, she realized she didn't quite fit in. All of her classmates went to church for hours every single week. They followed a very strict set of behavioral rules and personal values, and that just wasn't how Barbara lived her life. Barbara was originally from California, and she saw herself as more of a free spirit. She liked to explore new ideas, she liked to try new things, and she wasn't afraid to question the things she had been taught. Over the past 3 years at the school, she had started to feel more and more frustrated by it all. She felt alienated by the very rigid lifestyles of the other students around her. She had been hopeful, though, that things might change with her new living situation. Just 2 months earlier, in January, she had moved into a house with 7 other girls. But now, it was March, and it was already very clear that these new roommates didn't like her any more than anyone else did. They were just as religious as all the other students at BYU, and they seemed to think Barbara was strange. They didn't understand why she did things like date different people, or why she was so interested in experimenting with different religions. To them, it just didn't make any sense. So Barbara eventually decided that instead of trying to win her roommates over or change who she was to fit in, she would just lean into the person they already thought she was. She started trying to make them uncomfortable on purpose. She would say things that she knew would shock them, like telling them that she prayed to the devil. And for these very devout young women, that was a deeply disturbing thing to hear. After a while of this, Barbara started to get the feeling that her roommates weren't just weirded out by her anymore. They were now actually afraid of her. And that, of course, just made Barbara feel even more isolated and alone. And so, all of this is what led to her sitting at her desk writing that letter. She was telling her roommates that she was just going to leave campus for a while. She was going to go and be with people who actually understood her, who accepted her for who she was. The people she was thinking about were people like Richard Finder. Richard was a man who claimed to be a psychic. Barbara had first connected with him after she called into a local radio show where Richard was a guest, giving psychic readings to people who called in. The two of them had hit it off immediately. Even though Richard was almost a decade older than her, he seemed to understand Barbara in a way that nobody else in her life really did. Ever since that first phone call, they had developed this very intense relationship. It felt to Barbara like it was both romantic and spiritual at the same time. But Richard lived far away in California, so most of their relationship up to this point had been over the phone. And so, in her letter, Barbara was thinking about how nice it would be to be physically closer to Richard and to the circle of friends that he had. But there was another reason Barbara was so eager to get away from BYU. Lately, she had started to feel unsafe. Being a young woman on a college campus was starting to feel dangerous to her. Recently, there had been some very scary stories in the national news about women at other colleges being attacked. One student up in Washington State had been brutally beaten in her dorm room back in January. And then another young woman from a different school had gone missing just the month before, in February. And even though these attacks hadn't happened at BYU, they still really freaked Barbara out. It especially scared her because the women who had been targeted looked a lot like her. They had long, dark hair and similar facial features. It was an unsettling coincidence. So, as a precaution, Barbara had started taking judo classes at the university. She had also asked her best friend, a guy named Jerry Hicker, to help her buy a gun for protection. The only problem was Barbara had recently lost that gun. She hadn't been able to find it for the past few weeks. She had even reported it missing to the campus police, but she truly had no idea where it could have gone. For now, though, Barbara tried to push the thought of the missing gun out of her mind. She took a deep breath and she finished writing her goodbye letter. She folded it up and then she glanced over at the clock on her wall. It was almost 10 in the morning, which meant she needed to get going if she was going to make it to her class on time. So she grabbed the letter and tucked it inside of her purse. Inside her purse, she also had a turquoise necklace. It was the single most valuable thing that she owned. Her plan for the day was to sell it. She was going to pawn the necklace to get some seed money so she could leave town. She figured that however much money she got for it would determine where she would go next. As Barbara slung her bag over her shoulder and got ready to head out the door, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway outside her house. The sound was a relief to her because she had actually let her best friend Jerry borrow her car to go skiing the other day. She had been hoping that he would drop it off before she had to leave for class. It sounded like he had. So Barbara hurried out her front door to meet him. And sure enough, there was her car, and there was Jerry climbing out of the driver's seat. He waved her keys in the air, basically signaling to her that he was back. As Jerry handed the car keys back over to Barbara, he asked her if they were still on to hang out later that day. But Barbara's mind was somewhere else. She was thinking about getting to class, and she was also thinking about the logistics of selling her necklace. She had decided that her best bet would be to go to Salt Lake City. It was less than an hour's drive north of Provo, and she figured a bigger city would have more pawn shops, which meant she'd probably get a better price for it. And now that Jerry had dropped her car off, she could drive up there right after her class was over. So, as Jerry was talking, Barbara just kind of nodded vaguely at whatever he was saying. Then she took the keys from him, jumped into her car, and drove off towards campus. Over an hour later, Barbara was sitting in her social work class, waiting for the professor to dismiss them. As she sat there, she could hear some of the other students whispering behind her. And even though she couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, she felt her face start to get hot and red. She didn't know for sure if they were talking about her, but if they were, it certainly wouldn't have been the first time. It felt like people were always talking about her. So Barbara just did her best to ignore them. And then, the second the professor said they could go, she jumped up from her seat, shoved her books into her bag, and she hurried out of the building. She walked quickly to where her car was parked in the student lot. She got in, started the engine, and pulled out onto the street. And as she drove away from the BYU campus, she actually felt a wave of excitement wash over her. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace. She couldn't wait to get out of this place for good. About 3 hours later, Barbara's best friend Jerry was walking up the sidewalk to Barbara's house. He thought that they had made plans to meet up that afternoon, but Barbara had never shown up. This was really unusual for her. Barbara wasn't the type of person to just blow off plans without at least calling to let him know. So now, he was at her house just to check on her and make sure everything was okay. When he got there, Jerry noticed that her car wasn't in the driveway. He just stood there on the sidewalk for a minute, wondering what he should do. He thought about maybe going inside and asking her roommates if they knew where she was. But he ultimately decided against it. He knew they didn't really like him, just like they didn't like Barbara. So instead, he just turned around and started heading back to his own place. But as he was walking back, he passed by an apartment complex that was just down the street from Barbara's house. And as he passed it, he stopped dead in his tracks. He could clearly see Barbara's car parked there in the apartment complex's parking lot. This was definitely strange. As far as Jerry knew, Barbara didn't know anyone who lived in that building. So now he was really starting to worry about her. Jerry walked over to her car to get a closer look, and when he peered through the driver's side window, he saw that there was a note sitting on the passenger seat. He tried the door handle, and to his surprise, it was unlocked. So he opened the door, reached inside, and he grabbed the note. He began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heart start to beat faster and faster. An hour later, Jerry ran into the campus police station. Barbara's roommates were following right behind him. After he had found the note inside of Barbara's car, Jerry had gone straight back to Barbara's house. He showed the note to her roommates and asked them if they had seen her at all. Because now, after reading the note, he was worried that it might be some kind of suicide note. The note was the goodbye letter that Barbara had written earlier that day. In it, she said that she was leaving to be with her people, and the way it was phrased, the tone of it, it just felt alarming to Jerry. Now, Jerry could tell that her roommates thought he was overreacting. To them, the note just sounded like Barbara being dramatic again. But he had insisted, and they had ultimately agreed to come with him to the police station just to be safe and make sure everything was okay. So, as soon as the officer on duty came out to the front desk, Jerry quickly explained the situation. He told the officer that he'd had plans with Barbara that day and that she hadn't shown up, which was very uncharacteristic of her. Then he explained how he had found her car in that strange parking lot and how he had found this letter inside. He explained his concerns about the letter's tone. The officer listened patiently and then said, "Okay, we'll look into it." And so, over the next few hours, the campus police did just that. They started reaching out to some of the other students on campus who knew Barbara. They also placed a call to Barbara's family. But nobody had seen or heard from Barbara since that morning. And so, the police continued to look into it. They were now realizing this could be a legitimate missing persons case. But technically, not enough time had passed for them to officially declare it as one. So, for this first day, everything was just preliminary. They were just gathering information and waiting. The next day, almost 50 miles north of the BYU campus, a man who worked for a Utah utility company was hiking up a trail in a place called Big Cottonwood Canyon. This was a hilly, remote nature preserve on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. His official reason for being there was to check on some water lines that ran through the area. But he was also taking his time and enjoying the hike. This area was really beautiful. It was high up in the mountains, and it was incredibly remote and peaceful. So, this worker was genuinely shocked when he finally reached the top of the trail and saw that he wasn't alone. There was a woman up there. At first, the way his brain processed what he was seeing was that this woman was lying on the ground, and she appeared to be either nude or at least partially nude. And his first thought was, oh, she must be sunbathing. That's what she was doing up here, enjoying the peace and quiet. But then he thought, it's the middle of March. It's cold out. And also, she was lying face down on the ground, and as he got a little closer, he could see that she was definitely completely naked. He took a few more steps forward, and then his brain finally caught up and fully processed what he was actually looking at. At that point, he just gasped, turned around, and he ran as fast as he could back down the trail to his car to call the police. Within the hour, Captain Pete Hayward with the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office was driving his police cruiser along a remote access road that led into Big Cottonwood Canyon. Now, under normal circumstances, Hayward loved being out in nature. In his spare time, all he really did was hunt and fish. But right now, the beautiful scenery and the remote location were actually just a huge inconvenience. He needed to get to his destination as quickly as possible, and that was just very hard to do out here on these winding mountain roads. Hayward had just gotten a call about a woman who had been found dead up in the canyon by that utility worker, and while a few first responders were already on the scene and had secured the area, Hayward knew that they wouldn't really be able to do much of anything until he got there. Because when Captain Hayward worked a murder case, every single detail had to go through him first. A few minutes later, Hayward saw some police cars parked up ahead on the side of the road. He also saw a deputy waiting for him by a trailhead. So he pulled his car over, got out, and then he followed the deputy up a very steep trail for about 300 yards. He was pretty out of breath by the time he saw a small group of other crime scene techs and officers gathered around a large bush. And there, underneath the bush, was the body of a naked woman lying face down on the ground. Hayward walked over and he crouched down to get a closer look and examine the body. And right away, he could see at least 3 distinct bullet wounds in the woman's back. But other than those wounds, he didn't see any other obvious injuries. And there were no clear signs of decomposition yet. His best guess, just from looking at her, was that this woman had probably been there for maybe a day or so. Which, when he thought about it, was actually a bit of a miracle. At this time of year, almost nobody ever came out to this particular area. If it hadn't been for that utility worker checking on the water lines, she might not have been found for months, maybe even longer. Hayward looked at the ground next to the body, and he saw the woman's clothes and her shoes. They were right there nearby. And he noticed that each individual item of clothing was folded very neatly. This struck him as being very strange. Hayward pulled on a pair of gloves and he began to carefully examine the clothing. He could see that there was nothing ripped or damaged on any of the items. And also, as Hayward stood up and kind of walked around the immediate area, he noticed that the entire scene was just as neat and orderly as the clothes were. There was no gun anywhere to be found. And there were no marks in the dirt that would suggest a struggle or a fight had taken place. There was also no indication that the body had been dragged from one place to another. And so, from all of this, Hayward felt pretty confident that this woman had most likely been shot and killed in the exact spot where she was now lying. Hayward stood there in the middle of the trail and he considered everything that he was seeing. The neatly folded clothes, that could mean a few things. It could have been that they were removed during some kind of consensual sexual encounter, and then maybe things had turned violent afterwards. Or it could mean that the woman was maybe forced to undress at gunpoint and she had folded them herself. Either way, Hayward's gut was telling him that this woman's killer was almost certainly someone she knew. Because the thing was, getting all the way up here from the road was not an easy task. Hayward himself was pushing 50 years old, and he knew he wasn't in the best shape, but even for someone who was young and fit, it would be incredibly difficult to force another person all the way up a steep trail like this against their will. It just made a lot more sense that this woman had first walked up the trail willingly with someone that she probably trusted. And then that person had killed her once they were up here, far away from anyone who could see or hear. But Hayward knew that his theories didn't really mean much until he could figure out who this woman was. She didn't seem to have a purse with her, and when he checked the pockets of her neatly folded clothes, there was no ID inside. So Hayward waved some of the other officers over to help him. They needed to carefully flip her body over so they could look at the ground underneath her. And when they did that, Hayward saw that there were a few bullets that had been gathered there in the dirt. They had clearly gone straight through this woman's body from the shots in her back. So Hayward quickly told one of the crime scene techs to go ahead and photograph and bag those bullets so they could be sent for testing. He also told them to collect some of the dirt that the bullets had been lodged in, just in case there was some other kind of evidence mixed in with it. Now, investigators in the 1970s did not have the ability to rely on DNA evidence yet, but they could test for other things like clothing, fibers, or hairs, and it was possible that they could potentially connect that kind of material to a suspect. So, after giving his team their marching orders, Hayward took a deep breath, and then he started to head back down the trail toward his car. He needed to go and find out this woman's name. The next day, which was Wednesday, March 13th, Hayward was hustling down a hallway towards a meeting room at the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office. He was bleary-eyed, and he was basically just running on adrenaline at this point because he had been working on this case non-stop since the day before. He had just come from a meeting with the ballistics expert who had told him that the gun that had killed this woman was likely a .357 caliber pistol. Now, this was obviously great information for the investigation. However, a .357 wasn't a particularly uncommon type of gun, so it didn't really narrow down the list of potential suspects by a whole lot. But Hayward had uncovered something else that was a major breakthrough for the investigation. and that was the victim's identity. It was two-year-old Barbara Rocky. So Hayward's team had put out a broadcast over the local news the night before, letting the public know about the discovery of this unidentified body. And after they had put that broadcast out, they had gotten a call from the BYU campus police about a student of theirs who had gone missing just a day earlier. And then, just a few hours ago, some of this missing student's classmates had come all the way up to Salt Lake City to identify the body. And they had confirmed that it was, in fact, Barbara. Now, Hayward had already spoken to some of those kids who had identified her, and he had some of his other officers contacting Barbara's family. But right now, Hayward was on his way to a conference room to get a formal statement from a young man named Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the people who had identified the body, and he was also the very first person to report Barbara missing. So, Hayward was hoping that he would have some information that could point them in the direction of Barbara's killer. Minutes later, Hayward sat down at a long conference table directly across from Jerry. And from the looks of it, Jerry was very rattled. He kept shaking his head and looking away, like he was trying really hard not to cry. But Hayward was not a particularly gentle interviewer. So he didn't waste any time with condolences or offering him tissues, especially because, in his mind, Jerry was an obvious suspect. He was apparently Barbara's closest friend at school, and Hayward was already sure that Barbara had been killed by somebody that she trusted. So he just bluntly told Jerry that he needed to know every single thing that happened on the day that Barbara went missing. Jerry was sort of caught off guard by this level of bluntness, but he took a shaky breath, and then he explained how he had borrowed Barbara's car the day before she went missing, and then he had dropped it back off at her place on Monday morning at around 10 o'clock. And then, he said, he went to the campus library for a few hours. He then said that he was supposed to meet up with Barbara later that day. They had made plans to hang out. But Barbara never showed up. And when he went over to her house to check on her, her car was gone. So he started walking back home again when he happened to see her car parked down the block outside of an apartment complex that he didn't understand why she would be at. He said he didn't think she knew anybody who lived over there. And he said that he walked up to the car, he looked inside, and he saw that there was a note on the seat. He tried the door handle, found that it was open, so he reached inside, he got the note out, and he read it. And he said it was a pretty disturbing note. He thought that maybe it was a suicide note. Hayward nodded as he listened. He had already seen the note. The BYU police had given it to him when they transferred the case over. It did seem to be from Barbara, and it was telling her roommates that she was leaving town to be with people who she felt she fit in with. But the note was kind of vague, and Hayward really wasn't sure what to make of it just yet. You know, it could be a suicide note, or it could be something entirely ordinary, just a young woman telling her friends she was leaving. And the truth was, he wasn't actually even 100% sure that Barbara had really been the one to write the letter. It was possible that her killer had written it. Maybe whoever had murdered Barbara was trying to make her disappearance look like a suicide, or maybe imply that she had just run away from home in the hopes that the police would never even start looking for her body. And so, to be sure, Hayward had sent the letter off to a handwriting expert to see what they thought. Now, Hayward asked Jerry about his relationship with Barbara. And Jerry explained that the two of them hung out all the time, and that she had kind of gravitated towards him because she felt so unwelcome at school and around her roommates. He said they didn't really like her because she wasn't religious like they were. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had made the conflict with her roommates much worse by intentionally saying sacrilegious things in order to freak them out. So, he said, there was a lot of tension in that house, and it had gotten so bad that at one point, he had even tried to find Barbara another place to live. This made Hayward perk up a little bit. I mean, knowing that Barbara had a potential conflict at home, that was a very interesting lead. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon women were not necessarily his obvious murder suspects, it was definitely something that was worth looking into. Maybe one of them had been so horrified and outraged by Barbara's constant teasing that they had finally just snapped and tried to hurt her. Hayward didn't have any other questions for Jerry at the moment, so he stood up and he told him that he could go. He wasn't ready to officially eliminate anybody as a suspect just yet, but so far, Jerry seemed pretty unlikely to be the killer. He had an alibi for part of the day, and he was also the one who had reported Barbara missing in the first place. And considering that it was complete and total luck that her body was even found at all in the remote area that it was in, it really would have been in the killer's best interest to just keep quiet and hope that her body was never discovered. So, why would Jerry go to the police at all if he was the one who had killed her? So, Hayward headed out the door to go wrangle some of his other officers. They needed to go down to Provo and have another word with Barbara's roommates. The next afternoon, just 2 days after Barbara's body was found in the canyon, Hayward pulled his car up to a pawn shop on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. If he thought that he was tired yesterday, well, he was absolutely exhausted now. Because a lot had happened in the last 24 hours. They had gotten in touch with Barbara's family, who were obviously shocked and devastated by the news, but they didn't have any useful information for the investigation. They didn't know much about Barbara's friends or her life at school, so they couldn't say if there was anybody who would have wanted to hurt her. And they had no idea that she had been planning to leave campus for any reason. But apparently, she had been planning to leave because the handwriting expert had gotten back to him and had confirmed that the note found in her car was authentic. Barbara did in fact write it. So, her plans to leave town appeared to be genuine, which is what the note basically said if you just read it literally. But for Hayward, after he had spoken to Jerry, who had told him about all the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and also after Hayward had now literally spoken to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, and they had all pretty much admitted that they did not like Barbara, it made Hayward think that the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally. She was just trying to flee the campus and get away from her living situation, and in particular from her roommates. But all of the roommates had solid alibis for the day that Barbara went missing. So, for now, Hayward basically had to rule out the roommates as suspects. But Hayward wasn't that upset about this because the roommates had actually given him another lead. According to one of the roommates, right before Barbara had disappeared, she had mentioned to them that she was planning to go pawn a turquoise necklace that she owned somewhere in Salt Lake City. So, Hayward and some of his other officers had spent the entire day canvassing all the pawn shops in that area to see if maybe she had actually gone through with it. Now, so far, Hayward had not found the necklace, and he hadn't found the pawn shop that maybe Barbara had gone to. But he was very hopeful, maybe a little too hopeful in some ways, because, aside from this one long-shot necklace lead, the investigation was really kind of losing steam. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but they hadn't found anything significant. They had also gotten the autopsy report back, and it was mostly unhelpful. The medical examiner had actually counted 5 gunshot wounds in her body, not just the 3 that Hayward had initially thought, but they couldn't confirm whether or not Barbara had been sexually assaulted. And also, the forensics report had come back from the crime scene, and they had not been able to collect any fingerprints from the area. And so, all of this was swirling around in Hayward's head as he stepped into this particular pawn shop. He walked up to the counter, and he asked the woman who was working there if they had recently purchased a turquoise necklace. And to his complete and utter shock, the woman said, yes. And then she gestured towards a glass display case that was behind the counter. And there, Hayward could see a long white necklace that was lined with turquoise stones sitting on a red felt pad. About a half an hour later, Hayward was back behind the wheel of his police cruiser, and his heart was pounding and his mind was racing so fast he could barely even pay attention to the road. Because Hayward finally had a real trail to follow here. The shop clerk's description of the person who had sold that turquoise necklace matched Barbara's description perfectly. And not only that, the shopkeeper also had a receipt for the sale that showed that Barbara had been at the store on March 11th at 12:50 the afternoon, the exact same day she went missing. But the most incredible part of this new lead was that Barbara had apparently told this clerk that she was in a hurry because her boyfriend was circling the block outside in the car. And this was huge, because Hayward and his team had spoken to a lot of people in Barbara's life, and not a single one of them had mentioned a boyfriend. Now, unfortunately, the pawn shop worker had not gotten a good look at this person, this boyfriend that Barbara was talking about. So, Hayward had just taken the necklace and the receipt as evidence, and now he was rushing back to the precinct to make some phone calls. He needed to see if anybody in Barbara's life knew about this boyfriend and maybe had just failed to mention it for some reason. But as soon as Hayward parked his car and hurried inside the precinct building, he was stopped by a deputy. And this deputy seemed just as excited and frazzled as Hayward himself felt. The deputy told Hayward that he wasn't going to believe this, but they had been continuing to do their background interviews with Barbara's friends. And some of her friends had said that Barbara had in fact mentioned a boyfriend to them, a man named Richard. This was great news for Hayward. I mean, he was literally looking for exactly this information. But this actually was not the reason why the deputy was so worked up. It wasn't just the fact that she had a boyfriend. He explained that this man, Richard, was Richard Finder, a supposed psychic from California who just so happened to be in town on a ski vacation at the exact same time that Barbara was killed. And the reason that they knew that was because Richard had just called the station completely out of the blue and had offered to help with the investigation. A few hours later, Hayward sat down across an interrogation table from 30-year-old Richard Finder. Richard had on a pair of glasses and he had a goatee, and he seemed very confident and also quite eager to help. But to Hayward, it just felt like he was putting on some kind of an act. He felt certain that Richard had to be Barbara's killer. After all, it actually was not that unusual for murderers to insert themselves into the murder investigation of their own victims to sort of, see what the police knew and maybe to deflect any blame away from themselves. And so for Hayward, he felt like that was exactly what Richard was doing right now, calling in to offer up his supposed psychic services. But also, Hayward had spent the last couple of hours digging into Richard's background. And he had also discovered that Richard owned a .357 pistol, the exact same kind of gun that had been used to kill Barbara. And on top of all that, he found out that the place where Richard was staying while he was in town was in Salt Lake City, and it was very close to Big Cottonwood Canyon, the same place where Barbara's body had been found. It was just too many coincidences to ignore. And so, Hayward was prepared to get extremely tough with Richard in order to get a confession out of him, but Hayward got a few of his standard background questions out of the way first. And after asking Richard how he knew Barbara, Richard explained that they had connected after she had heard him speak on the radio. And he said that they had actually never been physical with each other, but that they had had a very deep and spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward just cut to the chase, and he asked Richard point blank why he had called the station. And at that point, Richard became very serious, and he said that he felt like he needed to come forward because he had a feeling about what had happened to Barbara. He said, because he was a psychic, he had had a vision, and in his vision, he saw that the gun, the murder weapon, had been thrown into some water somewhere. Hayward could not believe what he was hearing, because the police had not announced to the public that the murder weapon was missing. Richard should not have known that they were looking for the murder weapon, but clearly, he did. So at this point, Hayward did not ask any more questions about what his supposed vision said. Instead, he demanded that Richard account for every single hour of his day on Monday, March 11th, the day that Barbara had gone missing. And for the first time in the interrogation, Richard actually seemed genuinely thrown off by the question. He just sort of stared back at Hayward in what seemed to be complete shock. And then he said that he didn't kill Barbara. He said that he couldn't have. He was with his friends the whole day. Hayward just kind of glared at Richard from across the table, and then he slid a pad of paper over to him and told him to write down his friend's information so that they could follow up and check his alibi. And as he watched Richard hurry to jot down some names and phone numbers, Hayward felt sure that this was their guy. There was just a mountain of circumstantial evidence that was piling up against him. but he knew that they needed something more concrete if they were actually going to make an arrest. So Hayward first would have to check out Richard's alibi, and then he would also have to test Richard's personal gun, his .357, against the bullets that had killed Barbara. So he told Richard that for now he could go, but that they would need to take a look at his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward was sitting at his desk in the sheriff's office, at that time staring down at the ballistics results that had come back from Richard's gun. And it would turn out that it was definitely not the gun that had been used to kill Barbara. And Hayward literally could not remember a time in his career when he had been more frankly shocked and disappointed. I mean, he had really had Richard pegged as the killer. Richard was basically his only suspect, and he was a great one, especially since they had checked on his alibi, and it didn't really hold up. The friends that he said he was with for that whole day had actually told them, well, we were with him, but not for the whole day. So basically, there were large chunks of time on the day that Barbara went missing when Richard was completely unaccounted for. Hayward sighed, and he reminded himself that, just because the gun that he owned wasn't a match, it didn't necessarily mean that Richard was innocent. I mean, it was entirely possible that he had used a different .357 to commit the murder, and then he had just ditched that weapon afterwards. Still, though, Hayward couldn't believe that they were basically back to square one like this. He felt like he had done everything that he could at this point. He had talked to everyone he needed to talk to. He had analyzed all the evidence that they had gotten, and he really had nothing to show for it. Hayward was used to closing his cases and giving families the answers that they so desperately wanted. And now, he was worried that he was not going to be able to do that for the Rocky family. And sure enough, over the coming months and then years, Hayward did continue to investigate this case, but the leads got fewer and fewer, and then eventually he got promoted, and then before long, he was pulled into other new cases. And eventually, Barbara's case just went cold. In the fall of 2005, so over 25 years after Barbara's murder, a detective named Todd Park was sitting on the floor by his desk in the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. All around him, on the floor, it was covered with old crime scene photos and interview transcripts and evidence logs from the original 1974 investigation of Barbara Rocky's murder. Park was a brand new homicide detective, and he had taken on this case after getting a call from one of Barbara's relatives begging the sheriff's office to reopen it. And Park wasn't sure if it was maybe just his new guy enthusiasm, but he was already pretty obsessed with trying to solve it. He really wanted to find some answers for the Rocky family, since they had been wondering what had happened to Barbara for now over 2 decades. And Park actually felt pretty optimistic about his chances. Because even though during the original investigation back in 1974, they hadn't been able to rely on DNA testing, they couldn't really even do DNA testing back then. Despite that, the original investigators had had the foresight to do a rape kit, and they had saved all of the evidence from the crime scene. They had saved Barbara's clothes, and they had even saved the dirt that was collected from underneath her body. Which meant that with all the current advancements in DNA technology, there was a really good chance that they could actually solve this thing after all this time. Park had already sent a few of the items from the evidence boxes over to the lab for testing, but while he waited for the results to come back, he was going over all the details of the original case file just to get a sense of how it was investigated back in 1974. And he found that it was a pretty unusual case. The murder had initially been investigated as a personally motivated crime. But while the case was cold, the police had also begun to consider the idea that maybe Barbara had been murdered by the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. That this wasn't personal at all, and that she was just one of his many victims. Ted Bundy had been arrested less than an hour away from where Barbara lived in Salt Lake City back in 1975, which was just 1 year after her murder. And he had been killing college-aged women all over the West Coast, including several in Utah, during the same year that Barbara was killed. But the investigators back in the late 1970s had eventually ruled Ted Bundy out after they had determined that he had been committing a different murder up in Washington state at the exact same time that Barbara was killed. So he could not have been her killer. But it was still possible that Barbara had been killed by a different serial killer who was operating in the area at the time. The year 1974 is notoriously known among law enforcement as the Year of Fear, because there were just so many different serial killers who were operating in the United States at that time. But as Park read through all the old case notes, he found himself agreeing with the original investigators' first instincts. He felt that Barbara's murder must have been personal. Also, just the sheer number of times that Barbara had been shot seemed emotionally charged to him. And so, Park believed that Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Finder, had to be the killer. I mean, after all, Richard had been in the area at the time of the murder, he basically had no alibi, and, he had brought up the fact that there was a missing murder weapon when the public didn't even know that yet. So, he knew things about the crime scene that he shouldn't have known, but Park felt like there were some other people in this case that also deserved a second look. People like Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hicker. It was true, he did seem to have an alibi, and Barbara had told that pawn shop owner, right before she was killed, that she was with her boyfriend, which she would not have referred to Jerry as. But if this was as emotional a crime as Park thought it was, then Jerry had to be considered. After all, he was Barbara's closest friend at school, and maybe he had heard that she was planning to leave town, and he had gotten angry at her for it. And then there were Barbara's roommates. They all seemed to have solid alibis, but maybe one of them had gotten somebody else to kill Barbara for them. I mean, Park knew that the original investigators hadn't found any evidence of that, but they also hadn't seemed to spend much time on the roommates one way or the other. They had just kind of quickly ruled them out and moved on. But Park also knew that it could have been someone that they hadn't even considered yet. Like the utility worker who had actually been the one to find the body. Or maybe it was another student at BYU who didn't like Barbara and had considered her an outsider or a weirdo. Park wasn't sure yet, but he was confident that they would be able to pick up some DNA from somewhere in the evidence that they had. And once they did that, they would find their killer. 2 years later, on an afternoon in October of 2007, Detective Park was pacing around his office. He would periodically stop and just look at the phone that was sitting on his desk. He was waiting for a call from the lab, and with each passing moment, he was getting more and more anxious. So at this point in Park's reinvestigation of Barbara's murder, the DNA testing had basically gotten them nowhere. Over the last 2 years, the medical lab had gone over almost every single item from Barbara's case file. They had tested her rape kit swabs, they had tested her clothes, but they hadn't been able to get any usable DNA from anything. It either just wasn't there to begin with, or it was just too old and it hadn't been preserved well enough over the decades. And so, the only thing that was left to test was the dirt. The dirt that the original investigators had collected from underneath Barbara's body all those years ago. Park actually had not originally sent in the dirt for testing because he didn't really think that it would have any DNA inside of it, but it was now the only piece of evidence that he had left. So Park knew that when the lab called this time, he would either be on his way to finally finding the killer's name, or his case would basically be over for good. But then, Park's phone finally rang. He immediately picked it up, and his mouth went dry when he heard that it was the lab on the other end of the line. And before Park could even ask them, they told him that they had a profile. They had been able to find traces of DNA in that dirt sample that had been taken from under Barbara's body. And when Park finally got his hands on that DNA profile and he ran it through their criminal database, he got a name. Based on the DNA evidence and a decades-long investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police now believe happened to Barbara Rockey on the 11th of March 1974. Just before noon, the killer watched as Barbara pulled up to the sidewalk in her car. The killer immediately walked over and jumped inside the passenger seat. They smiled at Barbara, and she smiled right back. And then, together, they drove to the pawn shop in Salt Lake City that Barbara wanted to go to. When they got there, Barbara hopped out of the car and she went inside the shop. And once she was inside, the killer moved over from the passenger seat to the driver's seat. They were going to be the one to drive the car from that point forward. And as the killer sat there in the driver's seat waiting for Barbara to come back out, their heart was racing. They couldn't wait for her to get back into the car because the killer was in love with her. And they had decided that today was the day that they were finally going to make their relationship physical. So, when Barbara came back outside and hopped into the passenger seat of the car after she had sold her necklace, the killer very excitedly turned to her and said, "Hey, there are some nice trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara clearly hesitated. It seemed like she didn't really want to do this. But the killer knew that Barbara was planning on leaving Utah. They knew that she had written a goodbye note and that she was selling the necklace to get funds so she could leave for good. So they kind of guilt-tripped her. They said, "Look, come on. Let's just go enjoy the beautiful countryside one last time before you leave town." Barbara just shrugged her shoulders and said, "Okay, fine." And so the killer, very excitedly, drove the car over to the canyon and they parked near a picnic area. Then the two of them got out of the car, and as they began walking towards the trailhead, the killer reached down and just touched the outside of their pocket just to make sure that the gun that they had stolen from Barbara was still there. Now, they didn't know if they were going to have to use the gun or not, but they just wanted to make sure that it was there and that it was ready. And so for a while, the killer and Barbara just hiked along this trail, just chatting and making their way up the mountain and enjoying the scenery. But at some point, the killer just couldn't wait any longer. They had to make their move. And so they stopped Barbara on the trail. And the killer, after making sure that nobody else was around, they moved forward and they kind of made their move on her. They touched Barbara in a way that was very clearly meant to be romantic. But immediately, Barbara kind of recoiled and jumped back. And she told the killer that she didn't want that, which immediately made the killer incredibly angry. And so the killer stepped towards her again. And they could see that Barbara had this very alarmed look on her face now, which just made them even more angry. So they pulled out Barbara's own gun and they aimed it at her, and then they told her to take off her clothes. And Barbara, she was horrified, but, she did as she was told. But she was intentionally taking her time. As she took off each piece of clothing, she would painstakingly fold it very neatly, all the while she was begging the killer not to do this. And then, after she had taken off all of her clothes and had stacked them in a neat pile next to her, she continued to plead with the killer. But the killer was so humiliated and so angry that they decided that enough was enough. And they shot Barbara right in the chest. And she crumpled to the ground. And then they fired wildly several more times until Barbara finally went still. And then, once Barbara was either dead or dying on the ground, the killer just panicked. And they turned and they ran back down the trail back to Barbara's car. They hopped in and they drove all the way back to Provo and the BYU campus. But on the way there, they stopped and they ditched Barbara's purse and the gun. And then, when they actually got back to Provo, the reason that they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex was so that when the killer got out of the car, Barbara's 7 roommates would not see them doing so. Then they fled, leaving Barbara's note behind in the car. Barbara's note was never a suicide note. It was a literal goodbye note that she had written for her roommates. But the killer figured that it sort of seemed like it could be a suicide note. So if they left it there, then when someone eventually found the car and found the note inside of it, they could tell the police that it seemed like maybe Barbara had killed herself. It would send the police in a direction that would hopefully not lead back to the killer. It would turn out that Barbara's killer was her best friend, Jerry Hicker. The original investigators didn't suspect Jerry at first, mainly because of his cooperation with them, and since he was the one who had also been the first person to report her missing. But they did begin to get suspicious of him when he eventually revealed his violent streak. The year after he killed Barbara, he was connected to a few different rape cases that had happened on the BYU campus. But they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest until decades later, when the lab finally found that DNA in the soil from the 1974 crime scene. They were able to match that profile to Jerry's DNA, which they had on file from his involvement in another unrelated crime. And so ultimately, Jerry had killed Barbara with her own gun. The same gun which he had helped her buy so that she could protect herself from killers just like him. By the time Jerry was arrested in 2007, he was already dying of cancer. He confessed to Barbara's murder in exchange for a reduced sentence, and he served 5 years in prison before he was released. He died in 2014. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was New Year's Eve, 1980 in the Twin Cities, Minnesota. The air was bitingly cold, the kind of cold that steals your breath and makes your bones ache. But inside the bars and restaurants, it was a different world. It was warm, loud, and full of hope for the year to come. 20-year-old Karen Potak was right in the middle of it all, celebrating with a group of her closest friends. She was a young woman with a bright future, full of life and laughter, and that night was all about saying goodbye to the old year and ringing in the new one with the people she cared about. They laughed, they danced, they made toasts. It was a perfect New Year's Eve. But as the night wore on, the energy started to wane. Karen wasn't a big partier, and she decided she'd had enough. She didn't want to make a big deal out of leaving, so she just quietly slipped out of the bar, planning to walk the short distance home. She stepped out into the frigid Minnesota night, and the cold hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't worn a proper jacket, a decision she instantly regretted. The streets were mostly empty now, the sounds of celebration muffled by the distance and the thick, cold air. She started her walk home, her steps a little unsteady from the drink she'd had, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. As she stumbled along, a car slowed down beside her. A man leaned over from the driver's seat and rolled down the passenger window. He offered her a ride. In her slightly intoxicated state, and with the cold biting at her skin, the offer sounded like a lifesaver. It was a stranger, yes, but he seemed friendly enough. She was cold, she was tired, and she just wanted to be home. So she got in the car. The door clicked shut behind her, and the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the dark, quiet streets. A couple of hours later, around 3 in the morning, the phone rang at the emergency dispatch center. A man's voice, frantic and panicked, came through the line. He was speaking quickly, his words tumbling over each other. He told the dispatcher there was an emergency, that they needed to send a police squad and an ambulance to the Menberg Manufacturing Company machine shop on Pierce Butler Route. He said there was a girl there, that she was hurt. The dispatcher tried to get more information, asking what had happened to her. But the man on the phone was evasive. He just kept repeating, "Just hurry." He said she was lying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks. When the dispatcher pressed for an address or for the caller's name, the man claimed he didn't know the exact address. And when asked who he was, the line went dead. He had hung up. Police and paramedics were dispatched immediately to the location. The area around the machine shop was industrial, deserted, and dark. It was not a place someone would be walking through at 3 in the morning. As they searched the back of the building, near the desolate stretch of railroad tracks, their flashlights cut through the darkness and landed on a figure on the ground. It was Karen Potak. She was unconscious, barely breathing. She had been brutally attacked, bludgeoned over the head repeatedly with what looked like a tire iron. It was a miracle she was still alive. Paramedics rushed to stabilize her, working quickly in the freezing cold before carefully moving her into the ambulance and speeding off to the hospital. Karen survived the attack, but the cost was immense. The severe trauma to her head had caused significant memory loss. When detectives tried to speak with her, she couldn't remember anything about that night. She remembered being at the bar with her friends, she remembered feeling happy, but everything after that was a complete blank. She had no memory of leaving the bar, no memory of the man who offered her a ride, and certainly no memory of the horrific attack that had nearly ended her life. The man who picked her up was their only lead, and he was a ghost. He was also, most likely, the same man who had made that panicked 911 call, a strange act of what seemed like remorse or maybe just a twisted part of his game. The police had very little to go on. They canvassed the desolate area where Karen was found, but it was an industrial park. There were no residents, no late-night businesses with potential witnesses. It was a ghost town after dark. The crime scene itself yielded no physical evidence. No weapon, no fingerprints, no footprints in the frozen ground. The case was a frustrating dead end from the very beginning. With a victim who couldn't remember her attacker and a crime scene that offered no clues, the investigation stalled. The brutal attack on Karen Potak officially went cold. The police could only hope that the attacker would make a mistake, that some new piece of information would surface. They had no idea that they would hear from him again, and that next time it would be even worse. 5 months passed. Spring arrived in Minnesota, melting the snow and bringing life back to the city. The memory of the New Year's Eve attack on Karen Potak had faded for the public, but for the detectives who worked the case, it remained an unsolved, nagging puzzle. Then, one day, another strange call came into the police dispatch. The voice on the other end was male, but this time it wasn't panicked. It was distressed, emotional, and filled with a chilling self-loathing. The man's voice was shaky, as if he were crying. He spoke in a soft, almost whimpering tone. He told the dispatcher, "Will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody else." The call was deeply disturbing. The dispatcher tried to keep him on the line to get a location, a name, anything. But just like before, the caller offered no useful information. He didn't say where he was or where his victim could be found. He just made his confession and then hung up, leaving the police with a terrifying but vague claim. At this point, the police didn't connect this new weepy-voiced caller with the frantic caller from the Karen Potak case. The tones were different, and there was no immediate evidence to link them. Without a body or a location, the call was just a disturbing piece of information, logged and noted, but not something they could actively investigate. They had no way of knowing that the man on the phone had been telling the absolute truth. Just a few hours after that chilling call, the terrible reality of his words came to light. A group of teenagers were walking through a wooded area, just enjoying the spring day, when they stumbled upon something horrifying. Lying partially hidden in the undergrowth was the body of a young woman. The police were called to the scene, and the victim was quickly identified as 18-year-old Kimberly Compton. She had been stabbed to death. An autopsy would later confirm the weapon was consistent with an ice pick. The call from the whimpering man suddenly became the single most important piece of evidence in a new murder investigation. Detectives began to piece together Kimberly's last hours. What they discovered was a story of heartbreaking innocence and bad luck. Kimberly had literally just arrived in Minnesota. She was a recent high school graduate who had decided to leave her old life behind and start fresh. She had packed her bags, bought a bus ticket, and traveled to the Twin Cities with dreams of a new beginning. She didn't know a single soul in the state. After getting off the bus, she had walked into the first restaurant she saw, a small, unassuming diner. She sat by herself at a table, probably feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness about the new chapter of her life. While she was eating, a man approached her table. He asked if he could join her. Kimberly, being friendly and perhaps a little lonely in this new city, said yes. They started talking. She told him her story, that she had just moved to town and didn't know her way around. The man seemed kind and offered to show her the sights, to give her a tour of her new city. For a young woman in a strange place, it must have seemed like a wonderful gesture of kindness. She agreed. She left the diner with him, getting into his car, likely believing she had made her first friend in Minnesota. It was a fatal mistake. Just 15 minutes after they drove away from that diner, he killed her, stabbing her with an ice pick and leaving her body in the woods for those teenagers to find. The police now had two horrific attacks on young women 5 months apart. With the two phone calls, they started to suspect they were dealing with the same person. The first caller was frantic, the second was full of remorse, but both had led them to a victim. It seemed their attacker had a bizarre compulsion to confess his crimes, even if he wouldn't give himself up. The investigation into Kimberly's murder was in full swing, but just 2 days after her body was found, the killer called again. And this time, he confirmed their suspicions. The same weepy, distraught voice came over the line. He said, "Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. I don't know why I had this tavern. I am so upset about it." His voice cracked with emotion. "I keep getting drunk every day, and I can't believe it. Feels like a big dream. I just can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else." And then he hung up. The call sent a shiver down the spine of everyone who heard it. He had named his victim Kimberly Compton. He had confirmed he was the killer. And he had promised to try not to kill again, a promise that no one in law enforcement believed for a second. The media got wind of the calls, and the public soon learned about the man who taunted police with his tearful confessions. They gave him a name that stuck, the weepy-voiced killer. The police now had his voice on tape, a crucial piece of evidence. They went back to the diner where Kimberly was last seen and spoke with the staff who were working that day. They were able to provide a general description of the man she left with, but it was broad. He was an average-looking white male, not particularly memorable. It wasn't enough to narrow down a list of suspects from the thousands of men in the city who fit that description. The investigation hit another wall. They had the killer's voice, a vague physical description, and his method of operation, but they didn't have a name. They didn't have any physical evidence from the Compton crime scene either. He was careful. He left no fingerprints, no fibers, nothing that could identify him. The city was on edge. A killer was stalking the streets, a man who could sound friendly one moment and turn deadly the next, a man who was then compelled to cry about it to the very people who were hunting him. For 6 long months, the city waited in fear. The weepy-voiced killer went silent. There were no more attacks, no more calls. Some hoped he had stopped or maybe even followed through on his threat to take his own life. But the detectives knew better. Killers like this don't just stop. They were just waiting for the next call, the next victim. And then it happened. The phone at the dispatch center rang again. The dispatcher who answered heard the same horribly familiar whimpering voice. "Please don't talk, just listen," the man began, his standard opening line. "I'm sorry. I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. The number of stab wounds was a new, brutal detail. Kimberly Compton was the first one over. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself. I'm just going to die with me. I killed them both." He was now claiming another victim. The call ended as abruptly as the others, leaving police scrambling. He said he'd killed again, but he hadn't said who or where. They had to wait. A day later, they found her. The body of a woman was found floating in the Mississippi River, caught in some brush near the bank. She was identified as 40-year-old Barbara Simons. The night before she was found, Barbara had been out at a local bar, just enjoying a casual evening. She was a regular there, known for being friendly and outgoing. At some point during the night, she struck up a conversation with a man she'd never met before. It started simply enough. She offered him a cigarette. They began talking, flirting, and seemed to hit it off. They spent a good part of the evening together, and it was clear to everyone at the bar that they were enjoying each other's company. As the night came to a close, they decided to leave together. Just before they walked out the door, Barbara turned to one of the waitresses, a woman she knew well. With a smile and a little laugh, she said something that would prove to be tragically prophetic. "Boy, I hope he's nice," she joked, "because I'm leaving with him." For some reason, that comment and the man she was with gave the waitress a bad feeling. It was just a gut instinct, an inexplicable sense of unease. She couldn't shake it. So, as Barbara and the man walked out, the waitress made a conscious effort to get a really good look at him. She studied his face, his build, his clothes. She committed his features to memory, not knowing that she was witnessing the final moments of Barbara Simons's life. As soon as Barbara and the man left the bar, he attacked her. He stabbed her to death, just as he had told the police, and then he dumped her body in the cold, dark waters of the Mississippi River. The investigation immediately led police to the bar where Barbara was last seen. They spoke to the staff, and the waitress, with the bad feeling, came forward. She told them everything. She told them about the man Barbara left with, about her own sense of dread. And then she gave them the break they had been praying for. She said, "I got a really good look at this guy. I would know him if I saw him again." This was the first real lead they'd had in the entire case. The detectives knew this was their chance. They brought the waitress down to the station and sat her down with book after book of mugshots. They showed her hundreds of photos of known felons in the area. She looked at each one carefully, her face a mask of concentration. Page after page, she shook her head. And then she stopped. Her finger landed on one of the photos. She looked up at the detectives, her eyes certain. "That's him," she said. "That's the guy." The man in the picture was a 38-year-old named Paul Michael Stefani. The name immediately raised red flags. Paul Stefani had a criminal record, including a conviction for aggravated assault. He also had a documented history of mental illness. He fit the profile. The police finally had a name and a face to go with the weepy voice that had been haunting them for over a year. They immediately put Paul Stefani under 24/7 surveillance. They needed to be careful. They wanted to catch him in the act, or at least gather more evidence to solidify their case. He was their only suspect, and they couldn't afford to let him slip away. But Stefani was slippery. Within just 24 hours of the surveillance starting, he managed to give his police tail the slip. He disappeared into the busy streets of downtown Minneapolis. The detectives were frantic. They knew what he was capable of. They feared the worst, and their fears were justified. After shaking his surveillance, Stefani went straight back to his hunting ground. He drove through the city until he found his next target, a 19-year-old street worker named Denise Williams. He pulled up alongside her and offered her a ride. She got in. Stefani drove her to a dark, secluded alleyway. As he turned off the main road and the car plunged into darkness, Denise sensed that something was terribly wrong. The friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by something cold and menacing. Her survival instincts kicked in. She looked around the car, desperate for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on a glass bottle sitting on the floor of the car. As Stefani made his move, lunging at her, she grabbed the bottle. She fought back with everything she had. She smashed the bottle over his head, the glass shattering. She used the jagged edge to cut his face, fighting for her life in the cramped confines of the car. The attack was brutal, but Denise's fierce resistance was something Stefani hadn't counted on. She managed to wound him badly enough that she could break free. She threw the car door open and scrambled out, running for her life down the dark alley, screaming for help. A neighbor heard the commotion and saw her running from the car. They saw the whole exchange and, sensing how wrong it looked, immediately called 911. By the time police arrived, Paul Stefani was long gone, but Denise Williams was alive. She was the one who got away. That very same night, the phone rang again at the police dispatch. But this call was different from all the others. The weepy voice killer wasn't calling to confess to a murder. He was calling for help for himself. The dispatcher answered and heard a man's voice, pained and gasping. He said, "I need an ambulance." The dispatcher asked for his location. He gave an address, 1505 Westminster. He said he was all cut up, that he'd been beat up. He gave his apartment number, 208, and told them he was bleeding from his arm, his face, his head. By this time, the police had released the audio recordings of the killer's previous calls to the public. His distinctive, weepy voice had been played on the radio and on television news. People all over the Twin Cities had heard it. And the dispatcher who took this call for an ambulance recognized it instantly. The chill ran down their spine. It was him. It was the weepy-voiced killer. The dispatcher calmly continued the call while simultaneously alerting police. They told their supervisor, "I think the weepy-voiced killer just called us." An ambulance was dispatched to the address Paul Stefani had given, and so were the police. They found him in his apartment, just as he'd said, bleeding from the cuts Denise Williams had inflicted on him during her desperate fight for survival. He was taken to the hospital to be treated for his injuries. But as he sat in his hospital bed, bandages on his face and arm, a group of police officers walked into his room. They placed him under arrest for the murder of Barbara Simons. The hunt for the weepy-voiced killer was finally over. Paul Stefani pleaded not guilty. The case against him went to trial, but the prosecution faced a challenge. They didn't have a lot of hard physical evidence directly linking him to all of the attacks. What they did have was the powerful testimony of the waitress who had positively identified him as the man who left the bar with Barbara Simons. And, most importantly, they had the audio recordings of the phone calls. Voice print analysis was still a developing field, but experts testified that the voice on the tapes was a match for Paul Stefani. The jury was convinced. He was found guilty. While he wasn't given a life sentence, he was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Given that he was already 38 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. He would almost certainly die behind bars. For 12 years, Paul Stefani sat in prison, maintaining his innocence. The families of his victims had justice, but not the full truth. There were still questions. Was he responsible for the attack on Karen Potak? Were there other victims the police didn't know about? It seemed those questions might never be answered. Then, 12 years into his sentence, Stefani was diagnosed with terminal skin cancer. Doctors told him he had, at most, a year to live. Faced with his own mortality, something inside Paul Stefani changed. The man who had denied everything for over a decade decided it was time to confess. He admitted to everything. He told detectives that, yes, he was the one who had brutally attacked Karen Potak on that New Year's Eve so long ago. He confessed to murdering Kimberly Compton, the young woman who had just arrived in the city with so much hope. He confessed to murdering Barbara Simons. He admitted that it was his voice on all those chilling phone calls. But he didn't stop there. He revealed a crime that police had never even connected to him. He confessed to the murder of a 33-year-old woman named Kathleen Greening. She had been found murdered in her own home, but the case had gone cold with no suspects. Stefani admitted he had killed her too, but for whatever reason, he hadn't made his signature weepy phone call to the police afterward. It was a final, horrifying revelation that showed the true extent of his violence. Shortly after his full confession, Paul Stefani died in prison, taking any other secrets he might have had to the grave. The case was officially closed, but the memory of the weepy-voiced killer, the man who murdered and then cried about it, left a permanent scar on the community he had terrorized. The haunting sound of his voice on those tapes serves as a chilling reminder of the monster who once walked their streets, a man who found his victims at random and then sought a strange, twisted form of absolution by confessing to the very people sworn to bring him to justice. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's sprawling 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground. From rim to rim, it's hundreds of feet wide. If you were to hike down the side of this crater to the very middle, you'd find this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. And this puddle is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this water and push your way through the very tight, very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, the world opens up around you. You're suddenly inside the biggest freshwater cave in the world, a colossal underwater chamber that plunges down to nearly 900 feet. For the very few people that have been deep inside, they say it's an unbelievable experience. They describe it as being like spacewalking, floating in a vast, silent, dark universe. For a young South African man named Dion Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman's Hole and explore its depths was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. It was just in his nature. By the time he was 17 years old, he was already racing cars and building his own motorcycles from scratch. He loved speed, he loved risk, and he loved mastering difficult skills. So it was no surprise that by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new, even more intense activity, cave diving. He took to it immediately. He had a natural talent for staying calm under pressure and a deep respect for the dangerous environments he was exploring. In a relatively short time, Dion had logged about 200 dives, building a solid reputation for himself in the tight-knit diving community. In the winter of 1994, during his Christmas break, an incredible opportunity came up. A diving group was planning a trip to Bushman's Hole. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, which is about the halfway point of the cave. It was a serious, technical dive that required a skilled and reliable team. They needed one more diver to round out their group, and they thought of Dion. When the invitation came, Dion was beyond thrilled. This was the dive he had been dreaming of. The day of the dive arrived, and the team was buzzing with controlled excitement. They went through their checklists, prepared their specialized gear, and reviewed the dive plan one last time. Everything had to be perfect. At that depth, there is no room for error. The dive began, and everything was going great. They descended through the narrow entrance and entered the vast main chamber. The descent was smooth, and they reached their target depth of 492 feet without any issues. They explored for a bit, their powerful lights cutting through the darkness, revealing the ancient silent walls of the cave. Then it was time to head back up. The ascent is just as critical as the descent, if not more so. You have to go up slowly, making decompression stops along the way to let the compressed gases in your body safely release. As they were making their way up, the diver just ahead of Dion looked back to check on him. Dion seemed perfectly fine. He was calm, his movements were steady, and he gave the universal hand signal for OK, a simple circle with his thumb and forefinger. He had his flashlight out, its beam steady in the dark water. The diver in front of him nodded and turned to continue the ascent. About 30 feet higher in the water, maybe a minute or two later, that same diver turned around again for another routine check on Dion. But this time, Dion wasn't there anymore. The space where he should have been was empty. The diver's heart hammered in his chest. He scanned the darkness below him, and that's when he saw it. He saw Dion's flashlight, which was still attached to Dion's gear, basically wavering as it sank farther and farther and farther down into the blackness of Bushman's Hole. The diver immediately stopped the group above him. He signaled an emergency. Then, without a second thought, he turned around and started swimming as fast as he could, straight down to try to get to Dion. He was pushing himself, kicking with all his might, his lungs burning, but Dion was sinking so quickly. The diver realized in a moment of terrifying clarity that it was a suicide mission to follow him. If he tried to go down that deep, that fast, he would either pass out from the pressure or simply run out of air long before he could get back. It was a horrible, gut-wrenching decision, but it was the only one he could make. Deeply saddened, and with no other choice, the group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure what had happened, they had a strong suspicion. They told Dion's grieving parents that most likely he had suffered from something called a deep water blackout. It's a sudden loss of consciousness caused by the extreme pressure at those depths. If that happened, he would have simply drowned without ever knowing what was happening. When authorities were notified about what happened to Dion, they mounted a recovery operation. But sending a person down that deep was too risky, so first, they sent a remote-operated vehicle, a small robot submarine, down to the bottom of Bushman's Hole to just locate his body. The robot spent hours scanning the bottom, its cameras peering through the murky depths. But they never could find his body. The only thing they ever found was his diving helmet lying empty on the cave floor. Dion's parents were devastated. Their adventurous, full-of-life son was gone forever. And what made it even harder was that they didn't have a body to bury. There was no funeral, no final goodbye. To have some kind of closure, they decided to go down to Bushman's Hole themselves. They put a plaque up on the rock wall next to the entrance, a small memorial to commemorate their lost son. For 10 long years, that plaque was the only physical marker of the life that was lost in the cave's dark water. Fast forward 10 years to 2004. Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old and extremely audacious cave diver, was making a dive in Bushman's Hole. Dave wasn't just any diver, he was one of the best in the world. On this particular day, he was attempting a record-breaking dive. He was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming only the third person in history ever to reach this incredible depth. The pressure at that level is immense. The danger is off the charts. It's a place very few humans have ever been. Shaw touched down on the sloping, silty bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel the line that had guided him down. He took out his powerful flashlight and began swimming slowly around the bottom, exploring this alien landscape. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and his light caught something. It was something out of place. He swam closer, and he immediately recognized what it was. It was a human body. The body was lying on its back, with its arms stretched out towards the surface, as if reaching for a light it could never touch. As Shaw moved in for a closer look, he knew instantly who it was. This had to be Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion had died inside of Bushman's Hole and had never been recovered, his story had become a legend in the diving community. Any diver that went into the cave was always keeping an eye out, just in case they came across him. Shaw hovered over the body and examined Dion, trying to see if he would be solid enough to be pulled to the surface. He could see that his hands had skeletonized, as had his skull. But incredibly, his diving mask was still perfectly placed directly on his skull. His wetsuit and his air tanks had kind of kept the rest of his body together, which gave him some mass. It meant that it might be possible to move him. Shaw gently tried to move him, but he couldn't get him to budge. His air tanks were caught on something on the cave floor. Shaw stayed there for another minute, carefully trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw's training kicked in. He started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm at an extreme depth. I have limited time. I'm going to die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he made a difficult choice. He ended up tying a thin, strong line to Dion's body so he could be located again easily. Then, Shaw began the very, very slow ascent back to the surface. It would take him hours of decompression stops to get back safely. On the long, lonely way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt for this young man who had died so far from home in this dark, cold place. All he wanted to do was get him back on land, to give him back to his family, to give them some kind of closure. And so, the moment he got to the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and told them what he had found. He said, I'm going to go back down and I'm going to get him. Shaw also found the contact information for Dion's parents. He called them and he told them directly, I have found your son. I am going to retrieve him for you. His parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe it. After 10 years of nothing, they were going to get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, months of preparation, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for the 8th of January 2005. The dive plan was incredibly complex and would take a full 12 hours to execute. And it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval by himself. That would be impossible. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down, the one to do the work at the bottom. A couple of minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in, and that diver would stop about 100 feet above Dave's maximum depth. Then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth, creating a human chain all the way to the surface. The plan was for Dave to get down to Dion, carefully place his body inside a specialized body bag, and then begin the ascent. He would carry the body up to the first diver waiting for him. That diver would then take the body and swim up to the next diver, who would take it up to the next guy and the next guy until Dion was finally out of the water. At 6:13 inches the morning, Dave Shaw entered the water. He had a camera mounted on his helmet to film the entire operation, both for documentation and for later analysis. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They had intentionally shown up a little bit late so as not to put any added pressure on Dave before he went in. They just stood there, silently, watching the bubbles on the surface. Dave Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's Hole. He was incredibly efficient. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he had expected to. As soon as he got down there, he shined his light around and he found the line he had tied to Dion's body. He followed it and went right over to him. He got the body bag out from his gear and he got to work. 13 minutes after Dave had submerged, the diver who was positioned above him, the first person who would receive Dion's body, began looking for signs that Dave was done and was moving up towards him. He was watching for the beam of Dave's flashlight to start ascending. But when he looked down into the blackness, he saw Dave's flashlight, a tiny pinprick of light far below, and it wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently, making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. The depths can do strange things to your perception. But after a couple of minutes, there was still no movement. A gnawing among a dread started to form in the diver's stomach. He began going deeper, descending past his planned depth to try to get a better look at Dave and see what was going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Dave was not moving at all. His light was stationary on the bottom of the cave. This diver immediately went into rescue mode. He started going straight down as fast as he safely could to get to Dave to try to help him if he still could. But as he was moving down, he heard this strange fizzling sound. He looked at his wrist, at his complex array of gauges, and he could see that one of his vital gauges had broken. This gauge was critical to managing his gas mixture and decompression. Without it, going any deeper would be a death sentence. And so, with a heavy heart, he had to stop. He couldn't go any farther. He had to turn around and go back up. And because of the extreme depth at which they were diving, he couldn't just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He had to make his required decompression stops along the way. But he had a small slate and a grease pen, and on it he wrote a short, terrible message: Dave's not coming back. He swam the slate up to the next diver in the chain, the diver who was supposed to have received Dion's body, but instead received this horrifying note. That diver read it, and then he took the slate and swam it up to the next diver, and then to the next and the next, all the way up to the surface. As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around the edge of Bushman's Hole, a group that included Dion's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned, absolute silence. No one could believe this was happening. It was a worst-case scenario that no one had truly allowed themselves to consider. And then, after the silence broke, Dion's parents were beside themselves with grief. Not only were they not going to see their son again, but now they felt like they were somehow responsible for Dave Shaw's death. It was a double tragedy, an unbearable weight of loss. Eventually, by the end of that very long and dark day, all of the other divers that were in the water successfully exited the cave. They were all physically fine, but emotionally shattered. As for Dave Shaw, much like Dion Dreyer, there really wasn't a safe way to get him out. And so, everyone slowly came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. The lines, the extra air tanks, everything. It was too much to deal with at that moment. A few days later, they did need to go down and collect their gear. So, the team gathered once again at the edge of Bushman's Hole. And before they began retrieving all of the lines, they stood together and sang Amazing Grace in memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines from the deep. And as they're doing that, they notice all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. They looked a little bit closer, and then they saw something else emerging from the depths. It was Dave Shaw's body, and tangled with him was Dion's body. Basically, what had happened was that Dave had been attached to one of the lines. And in his final moments, he had managed to free Dion before he had passed away. And so when the team pulled the line from the surface, both of them were freed from the bottom and they floated slowly up. And so, even though Dave Shaw would die doing it, he had fulfilled his promise. He was able to get Dion Dreyer out of Bushman's Hole for his family. After the two bodies were taken out of the water, they noticed that the camera on Dave's helmet was still intact. It was an incredible and somber discovery. It had filmed everything, all the way through his final moments. And so, they took the tape out and they watched it. They watched it forwards and backwards in slow motion, frame by frame. They analyzed it to the point where they finally understood exactly what happened at the bottom of that cave. When Dave gets down to Dion, Dion's body, which had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Dave had not been able to free him on his first discovery dive, had somehow become free. Now it was free-floating just above the bottom. And this actually made the situation much more difficult. Dave was having a really hard time trying to control this floating body in the weightless environment. And tragically, the body was literally breaking apart in front of him as he tried to handle it. As Dave is trying to wrangle the body into the bag, you can hear on the audio from the camera that he starts grunting. His breathing is getting elevated and rapid. He's totally losing control of the situation. And the bottom of this cave is slanted, and it's all covered in fine silt and mud. And so in the camera's view, you see all this mud and silt getting kicked up, and the visibility drops to almost zero. After a moment, the water clears a little, and you can see that Dave has gotten himself completely tangled in the thin cave line he was using, and that line is also tangled on Dion. So basically, Dion's body has now become a deadly anchor, pinning Dave to the bottom. At this point, Dave shifts his focus. He stops trying to bag the body and starts trying to get the lines off of himself. And you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air. And probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from severe nitrogen narcosis. It's a condition that divers run into at extreme depths, where it's like you've drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and confused. And it's clear from his actions on the video that he's becoming very disoriented. Instead of cutting himself free and going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save himself, he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection for some reason. Then he gets out a pair of small, sharp scissors from his gear, but he doesn't use them. He just holds them in his hand, as if he's forgotten what they're for. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear he's not going to be able to get him out at this point. And with the scissors still in his hand, which he never used because, again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and is deeply confused, he starts beginning to make his way over to the area where the main ascent line is, the way back up. But he starts slowing down. His movements become sluggish. His breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent. And then there's no more movement. And Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they were absolutely devastated about what happened to Dave Shaw and they felt a very heavy guilt, at the same time, they were so anxious because they were going to get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They didn't care what state his body was in. Just the fact that he was actually here, that their actual son was going to be in front of them, was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on one small detail. They saw that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently, they had bought him a set of jockey underwear just before his last dive, and he was still wearing them. As strange as it is to think about, for them, it was like they got to bond with their child one last time, a final, tangible connection after a decade of absence. The story of Dave and Dion is a stark reminder of the incredible dangers that lie beneath the surface in places most of us will never see. But these underwater environments are not just found in remote caves. Sometimes the most dangerous places are man-made and right in the middle of industrial areas. At 4 a.m. on the 25th of February 2022, a 36-year-old father of 3 named Christopher Boudrum woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine. And then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen. And by 5:30 in the morning, he was out his front door, into his car, and making the short commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater. Things like inspections on ship hulls, underwater welding, or just moving heavy equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just a 2-minute drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Paria Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Paria Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these huge underwater pipelines that the company used to get crude oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Paria had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot-long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea about 1,200 feet off the coast. Ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was sticking out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down the vertical pipe, it would shoot across the long horizontal section on the sea floor, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore, where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day, in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Paria Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called Berth Number 6. And unlike the rest of Paria Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, this one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just been sitting idle on the sea floor. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use Berth Number 6. And so they put it into a sort of storage mode. The vertical section of Berth Number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes. However, the other vertical section of Berth Number 6, the one that was closest to shore, was first plugged up. Imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine a massive pool toy. They basically jammed it down inside of the vertical section of the pipe, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight, sealing the pipe off. And then, once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then they also did something else. They put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of berth number 6. To understand what this is, you have to picture something else. Imagine you're in a bathtub and you have a bucket. You flip the bucket upside down above the surface, so there's just air inside of it, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand up under the bucket while it's underwater, and your hand will be dry. And so basically, that's what this habitat was. Paria Fuel took a huge steel box, like a giant bucket, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical pipe. So there was a permanent, breathable air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this was because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example today, when they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, the divers could swim down, get up inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they had put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing normal air. It was really kind of a luxury, a small, dry workshop 60 feet underwater. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then, once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before, men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe, and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall, and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. They climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their heavy gear, and then, once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set deep inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed solid. It hadn't been moved in 4 years and was probably rusted in place. So they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on. He dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface. He talked to the folks on the boat. They handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat. And then once he poked his head back up into the air pocket, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe. He reached down inside and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific and instantaneous happened inside of that space. We don't know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate that big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal. And suddenly, all this low-pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of empty pipeline made contact with the extremely high-pressure air that was inside of this habitat. And air, by its very nature, likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so, the second that seal was broken, the high-pressure air in the habitat violently expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum cleaner, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, and all 5 men into the pipe. And it also began sucking in seawater from outside the habitat. Basically, everything was going into this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on, went from just standing outside the pipe to, in a split second, being feet first, flying into this dark, narrow pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater crashing all over them. They're holding their breath, completely disoriented. And so they get sucked down the vertical section of the pipe, they turn the sharp corner at the bottom, and they get rocketed out to sea along the horizontal section. They are on the 1,200-foot-long stretch, just blazing a trail through the darkness. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow, it's only 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. You have to figure that all of them are expecting to die at any second. But eventually, the pressure inside of this long pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there now. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several-minute-long breath hold, eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some absolute miracle, they came to a stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket trapped at the top of the pipe where they stopped. And so they come to a stop, and they just start gasping for air. And then they begin yelling out to each other in the pitch blackness, and they realize all 5 of them are alive. And they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this small, precious air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all, they're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their faces. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking. They're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe. Meaning his head was closest to the vertical section that led up to the habitat near the shore, and all 4 other men were right below him, farther out to sea. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself, and again, we can hear him on the audio. He told the others to calm down and to link their feet onto the shoulders of the person below them. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys who are very badly battered at this point, they came flying in here, surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up. But they finally make their way until they're all linked up, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe, back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe and drown them. They also understood that there was limited air in this pocket, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they began this terrifying journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first completely flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point down the line, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on the audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe in pitch blackness. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way forward on a single breath hold. And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head. And he felt scuba tanks, 2 of them, that had been sucked in with them. And he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had a source of air. Now, they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their heads. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight above you. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place with their hands. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do, but this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they could with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the pressure gauge in the dark. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going and going. And finally, after hours of this, after Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air, they get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach an air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. He starts yelling to Christopher in the total darkness to stop, but he didn't have a reason. And Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal is starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can still hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal, "Hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you." And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further. But Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank finally hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped his head up. And it was, again, another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe for him to actually pull himself out. It was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well. There was nothing he could do. But luckily, there was a chain that was dangling down within arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually, 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Paria Fuel had their emergency response team on site. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized and badly hurt, he still ran up to the authorities and told them, "All 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You have to go back down. You have to save them." But ultimately, the authorities at Paria Fuel decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends, who are literally at that moment banging on the pipes so loudly he can hear them from the surface, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself, and they had to physically stop him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital, where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable. And they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface. But nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe because all of the men had died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's still unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent in the diving industry. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Paria Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe, still alive and waiting for help. Some of these underwater dangers are not man-made, but natural, and they have been waiting for centuries to claim victims. Situated an hour's drive from Johannesburg in South Africa lies Sterkfontein Cave. The cave is famous for the incredible hominid fossils that have been found there, and also for its stunning underground lake. The walls of this lake look like Swiss cheese. There are all these tunnels that spiderweb all over the place. Many of them are completely unexplored, and no one knows how deep the cave system actually goes. In 1984, a cave diver named Peter Verhulsel, along with 2 of his friends, decided they wanted to explore these underwater passageways in the lake. Specifically, they wanted to check out a chamber called Milner Hall, which was located fairly far down in the lake system. There was a guideline that was anchored from the surface of the lake all the way down into the different sections that had been explored. And this was so cave divers could hold on to it and make their way through the complex tunnels without getting lost. Now, I've never been cave diving, but from what I've read, there is one golden rule, an absolute law: you never, ever let go of the guideline. And if you do, it better be extremely well planned, and you should only do it with other divers present and a clear plan to get back to the line. Peter was a notorious risk taker, and he was also the least experienced cave diver of the 3. When they entered the lake, they were all holding onto the guideline, and Peter was the 3rd diver back in the line. And so they began their descent down into the dark water of the lake. At some point, Peter's curiosity got the better of him. He let go of the line to go look at something on the cave wall, something that had caught his eye. Luckily, the other 2 divers noticed it right away. They saw him drift off, and they swam over and got him and brought him back to the guideline. And even though you can't really communicate underwater, I'm sure they looked at him like, "Come on, man, don't do that." And so they kept going down. And then, once again, Peter's curiosity gets the better of him. He leaves the guideline again and goes over and checks something else out. The other two divers notice it again. They turn around, they grab him, and they pull him back to the line. And now they're looking at him very seriously, like, you cannot do this. No more. And so Peter's body language indicated that he got the message. He was back on the guideline and he wasn't going to do it again. And they continue down, and they're getting closer and closer to Milner Hall when the first two divers turn around to check on Peter, and he's just gone. And now, previously, when they found him, those other two times when he left the guideline, he was just over right against the wall, and he was easy to spot. But this time, he wasn't there. They're looking around with their lights, scanning the darkness, and he's nowhere to be found. And they're not prepared to go leave the guideline and venture into one of these unknown tunnels to go looking for him because there were so many of them. It was like Swiss cheese down there with all these different tunnels he could have gone into. And they didn't know which one he went in. And so after kind of waiting and looking around for a couple of minutes, thinking maybe he'll come back, they were running out of air. They had to go to the surface. So the two men surfaced, and they immediately called the police and explained what happened. Rescue divers were sent to the cave to go looking for Peter, but by the time they even got there, it had been several hours. It takes a while to mount this type of specialized search. And Peter only had one tank of air, so if he hadn't surfaced by now, the grim thought was that he had already drowned. But the rescue divers went into the lake anyway. They headed down to the area where Peter was last seen, and they looked around and they couldn't find him. And they surfaced pretty quickly, and they said, look, we're just not prepared to look through all these different tunnels he could have gone in just to find his body, because at this point, there's no way he's alive. He's been down here for hours. He doesn't have enough air. And one of us, one of the rescue divers, is going to get trapped and lost in one of these tunnels, and we don't want to lose anyone else. So, we're terminating the search. Peter's friends were devastated. They pleaded with the police, hey, can you let us go down and look for Peter's body for his family? And the police said, no. We're banning all diving in this cave. 6 weeks after Peter went missing inside of this lake, a group of dry cavers, people who explore caves without going into the water, were doing some work in a chamber that was right next to this underground lake. And they were chiseling at a section of the wall when all of a sudden the wall kind of collapsed, revealing another chamber on the other side of this wall. They took their flashlights out and they looked inside, and it looked like a tunnel that kind of weaved around a corner. And they shined their light on the ground, and it looked like there were some muddy or sandy footprints that were left, as if someone had been walking right there. The cavers were initially terrified. The idea that there's anything living behind the walls inside of a cave is a primal fear. But they cautiously stepped over the rubble, and they walked around the corner, and it revealed this huge hidden air pocket that clearly was connected to the underground lake because there was a pool of water right in the middle of this chamber. And there was no other way in besides, this wall that had just collapsed. And in the middle of the water, there was this island. It was like this sandy, muddy, rocky island right in the middle of this air pocket. And laying on the island was Peter. In a stroke of unbelievable luck, after Peter went missing from his dive, he had accidentally discovered this hidden air pocket. He had surfaced and climbed onto this island. He knew he didn't have enough air in his tank to get back to the surface the way he came, and so he figured, okay, I'll just sit on this island. There seems to be enough air in here for me. I'll wait until my dive buddies invariably go get help and come down here and rescue me. He sat inside of that dark air pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for a rescue that never arrived. Before he ultimately died of starvation, he wrote a message in the sand to his mother and to his wife, telling them that he loved them. To this day, diving is still prohibited inside of Sterkfontein Cave. Some of these deadly underwater traps are discovered in the most mundane ways. In 1938, a farmer in southeastern Australia decided to bring his horses to a watering hole on the other side of his large property. As he was leading the horses across this big, wide-open field, one of his horses suddenly just collapsed to the ground. The farmer ran over to see what was going on. But as soon as he got over to it, the horse had stood back up again and seemed totally unhurt. The farmer was puzzled because he had no idea why the horse had fallen in the first place. And so he looked down to see if maybe it had tripped on something. And he saw on the ground, right beneath where the horse had been, was this small hole. And so he moved his horse out of the way. And then when he came back to look at this thing, he saw it was only maybe a foot across. But when he peered down into it, he saw it was very deep. And so he got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look. And when his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could not believe what he was seeing. 10 or 15 feet below the surface was this huge pool of crystal clear water. The horse had just stepped through the thin roof of a massive underground cave. And so the farmer was really excited to see how big this cave was. And so he grabbed all his horses and he brought them back to the stable, and he got this long measuring rope with a weight at the end of it. So he runs back out to the hole. He puts the weight into the hole and he begins paying out this rope. And so down it goes, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. It just keeps on going and going until finally the weight hits solid land at 120 feet. And so the farmer is like, wow, this is a huge cave. So he pulls it back up thinking that's the bottom. But in reality, it wasn't. It actually extended down almost 300 additional feet. The farmer and his horse had just accidentally found one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world, a place that would come to be known simply as the Shaft. The reason it's called the Shaft is because the only way in or out of this underwater cave is through this single hole in the middle of this field that this horse created. And it's literally a vertical shaft that goes down 18 feet until it reaches the surface of this massive underground body of water. The opening to this shaft is so narrow that cave divers, they can't get into it with their gear on their backs. So they literally need to be lowered into this cave by themselves, and then their gear is lowered down after them, and they have to put it all on while they're treading water in the dark. The solid ground that the farmer's weighted line had touched at 120 feet when he believed he had reached the bottom of the cave, what he had actually touched was the top of something called the rock pile. The rock pile is basically this huge underwater pyramid that looks like a pile of giant rocks that sits at the bottom in the middle of this huge underwater cave. And from the top of this rock pile, you can go down it in all different directions. But once you get to the bottom of the rock pile, there are only two main tunnels to choose from. There's one that goes west, basically down at an angle that dead ends at 260 feet. And then on the other side of this underwater pyramid is the eastern tunnel, and that one is much more treacherous. It goes down at a more steep angle to 400 feet. The few elite divers that have explored the deepest recesses of this cave say there are 3 distinct stages to it. Stage 1 is from the surface down to 120 feet, the top of the rock pile. During this stage, the diver swims unobstructed in beautiful clear water with sunlight poking through the hole in the ceiling. It's a very easy section of the cave, and there's a safety line that's anchored from the surface straight down to the top of the rock pile, so you have something to hold on to as you go down and back up. Stage 2 is where things get a bit dicey. Stage 2 begins at the top of the rock pile and extends down all the way to the bottom of the westerly tunnel at 260 feet, where it dead ends, or down to the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel, where you come to something called the drop-off ledge. And it's quite literally a ledge in the middle of this tunnel where beyond it there's a fairly steep drop-off, and it leads down to an area that's so treacherous it's got its own stage. Starting with stage 2 and then with stage 3, there is no safety line to guide you in the direction you need to go. So you're on your own as soon as you reach the top of the rock pile. And so you make your way down any direction you want down the rock pile until you reach either of these tunnels. And as soon as you go into them, you immediately start to lose visibility because the sunlight cannot penetrate all the way into these tunnels. And so the diver becomes increasingly reliant on their flashlight. As such, they have to be very careful as they navigate down stage 2 to not bump into the walls, because doing so will knock the fine limestone silt off of the walls, It will create a cloud of it in their face. It will blind them. It's like being in a thick fog where a flashlight beam can't push through it, and so the diver has to either wait for the silt to clear, which could take a very long time, or they have to swim blind. Also, anyone entering stage 2 and stage 3, they can't breathe regular air out of their tanks. There's too much nitrogen in regular air. The deeper you dive, the more nitrogen your body will absorb. And if you have too much nitrogen in your system, it can give you something called nitrogen narcosis, which, as we know, is like being really drunk. And in extreme cases, people have been known to take their mouthpiece out and inhale water, believing they're on the surface. Or they'll confuse the direction up with the direction down. And to get to the surface, they will swim straight down until it's too late and they can't get back up again. And so divers that are going to be in stage 2 or stage 3 of this cave will breathe a special mix of gases that are low in nitrogen to try and combat this. The final stage of the shaft, stage 3, is just from the 200-foot mark of the easterly cave, so that drop-off ledge, all the way down to the bottom at 400 feet. This stage is unbelievably dangerous. As soon as you drop off that ledge, all the sunlight goes away. It is pitch black, and the tunnel narrows considerably and stays incredibly narrow. In fact, many times, divers have to squeeze themselves past sections where the rocks are too close together. And so, because you're inherently bumping into the walls all through stage 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to be silted out the entire time. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed, even if you're breathing a special low nitrogen mix of gases. And so, divers need to be ready to abort the dive at any moment if they feel symptoms coming on. Once the diver has turned around and is making their return trip, but they're still in the 3rd stage section of the cave, they need to be careful of false domes. These are offshoots on the ceiling only in this 3rd stage that look like the way out. And especially when things are silted out and it's dark, you're low on oxygen, you might be panicking, it would be very easy to confuse these with the way out. But in fact, these false domes are exactly what their name implies. They are false. They are dead ends. They go nowhere. Stage 3 is reserved exclusively for extremely experienced cave divers who get special permission. In 1973, 8 divers got permission to dive the 1st and 2nd stages of the shaft cave. They did not get permission to dive the 3rd stage of the cave. On May 28th of that year, the 8 divers arrived in that big open field near the cave opening and began prepping their gear. Their plan was to dive down all the way to the edge of the drop-off ledge, so looking into the 3rd stage, and then once they got there, look around for a minute, and then turn around and head back up to the surface. These 8 divers were experienced divers, but their experience was all in open water environments. None of them had ever dived in a cave before, and so they were confident divers, but they were a little bit naive. They believed the dive down to the edge of the 3rd stage was going to be fairly routine and would just be simple and fun. But before any of them had even gotten into the water, they had already made a critical mistake. Instead of filling their tanks with the special low nitrogen mixed gas that they would need since they were going into stage 2, which is a requirement, instead of doing that, they just filled their tanks with regular air. So they were basically guaranteeing that they would get nitrogen narcosis. But once they had all their gear prepped, they made their way over to the entrance to the shaft, and one by one they were lowered down into the water and their gear would follow. And then once all of them were all geared up, they grabbed the safety line and they began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes to get down to the top of the rock pile. And there they spent about 5 minutes taking pictures of each other before heading down the eastern tunnel. 3 of the divers were siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine, who were 25, 22, and 19, respectively. And Glenn remembers, after they made their way all the way down the eastern tunnel and they reached the drop-off ledge, he remembers seeing his sister, his brother, and all the other divers. Everyone seemed just fine. And everyone's just looking over this ledge. They're taking turns kind of peering down into this black abyss that is stage 3. And then after 5 minutes or so, Glenn looked at his gauge and he saw his air was getting fairly low. Not an emergency situation, but it was time to leave. And everybody else had the same amount of air as he did. And so everybody else was running low on air. And so Glenn was about to grab his sister, who was several feet right in front of him. She was still looking over the ledge down into stage 3. But when he reached out to grab her, she and all the other divers just suddenly jumped forward and dove straight down into the abyss, out of sight. They dove into the stage 3 section. This was not something that Glenn was tracking anybody doing. This was not something anyone said they were going to do. This was not part of the dive. This was very dangerous, and they weren't allowed to go down there. And so Glenn immediately swam down after them to try to grab his sister and stop her, or grab his brother, or grab any of them. But as soon as he went over that ledge, he saw it was totally pitch black, and it was completely silted out from all these divers suddenly launching over the edge. And so Glenn knows he's not going to find them in the silt. It's also very dangerous for him alone to just dive down there. And so he figures, you know what? I'm sure they're fine. They probably planned this out and they're just going to go down a little ways and they'll come back up again. And so I'll just go to the rock pile and wait for them. And so Glenn turns around and he goes up back over the drop-off ledge. He makes his way to the rock pile and he just sits there facing the eastern tunnel, waiting for his brother, his sister, and the other divers to come back out again. But they don't. And finally, his air gauge gets so low that he literally has to go to the surface. And he's thinking to himself, if my air is this low, what are they doing down there? 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers that went with Glenn's sister and brother and the other 2 divers into this forbidden 3rd stage section of the cave. Although he doesn't say this, it sounded like he and the others just wanted to go a little ways into this off-limits section, check it out, and then turn around and go back to the surface. And so Larry would say, as soon as they went over the ledge and they're in this 3rd stage, it went completely pitch black and the tunnel immediately constricted dramatically. And so as they're going down this very tight and pitch black tunnel, they reach a section that's so tight, they're down on their stomachs, literally pulling themselves through. And so after a few minutes of the group forcing themselves into this unbelievably dangerous place, it's like they all collectively realized this is a terrible idea. We need to turn back. And so as they all began turning around, they realized their return trip just back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only maybe 25 feet away, was completely silted out. And so Larry is in the back of this return trip line. And right in front of him is Christine. And so as soon as they all make their way into the silt, the only thing Larry can see with his flashlight is Christine's fins. And so he's staying right up on her and keeping his light on that fin to make sure he's going in the right direction. And so after only a few moments, Christine's fins just suddenly disappear. And so Larry's thinking, I don't know where she went, but I don't have enough time. I have almost no air. And so he just keeps on swimming, believing he's going the right way. And sure enough, he clears out of the silt and he goes up and back over the drop-off ledge. And he shines his light back up the eastern tunnel, back up towards the rock pile, expecting to see Christine and the other divers he was just with. But he's looking, and there's no one there. There's no silt. It's totally clear, and there's not one diver in front of him. So he looks at his gauge again, and he's got a little bit of air, enough to maybe go down and make sure nobody is still down there, because he's thinking, I don't think it's possible they could have swum all the way through this tunnel in this space of time. So he turns around, he goes back over the drop-off ledge, back into the silt. And as he's moving very slowly and cautiously, up ahead, he sees flashlights moving around on the ceiling of the tunnel. And so he moves down towards this flashing light. And he realizes the light is coming from inside of a false dome right above him. And so he looks up and he saw there was Christine and another man named Robert, who was 28, frantically swimming around, shining their lights, looking for the way out, not realizing they're in this dead end. And so Larry was about to shine his light to get their attention when Larry's flashlight went out. And so now Larry is in complete darkness. He is completely silted out. He doesn't even know how much air he has left because he can't shine the light on his gauge. And so he's starting to panic. He starts banging on his flashlight, and finally, the light comes back on. And when it does, he shines it straight up again to try to shine it towards Christine and Robert. But he had drifted farther down the tunnel. And so by the time he shined his light, he wasn't underneath the false dome. But when he shined his light in the other direction, he saw he was at the very far end of where the group had gone. And so, farther down into stage 3 was clear. There was no silt. And so he shined his light down into the stage 3 tunnel. And way down the tunnel, barely visible, he sees there is one diver with his flashlight out, swimming the wrong direction down into oblivion. His name was John. He was 20 years old, and he almost certainly had severe nitrogen narcosis. Larry knew he could not save him. And so Larry turned around and went back into the silt, back up in the direction of the rock pile, touching the ceiling, looking for that entrance into the false dome to try to help Christine and Robert. But he's not finding it. And he's looking at his air gauge, and it's getting critically low. And he knows if he doesn't go soon, he's going to die. And so at some point, after not finding the entrance to this false dome, he decides he just has to go out and save himself. And so he manages to get out of the silt. He goes up and over the drop-off ledge. He gets to the rock pile. He grabs the safety line, and he fins himself up to the surface. And when he gets to the surface, he looks around, and there are only 3 other divers up there, one of which is Glenn. And Glenn, he looks visibly panicked, and he yells to Larry, "Hey, have you seen my brother and my sister? Have you seen the others? Are they coming up after you?" And Larry looks at him and just shakes his head. He didn't know what to say. He knew they were gone. But for Glenn, this was his baby brother, his baby sister. He had to go back down. And so, with the little bit of air he had left, he put his mouthpiece in. He turned around and he dove straight down as fast as he could, staring towards the opening of the eastern tunnel, praying that his family members, that his friends are going to come out of there. But as he's swimming down and he's running out of air, no one was coming out of that tunnel. And so finally, when his air was basically empty, he had to turn around. And on that return trip back to the surface, he realized his siblings and his 2 friends were gone. It would take 11 months and 11 days to finally locate and recover all 4 of the bodies inside of the cave. John, the 20-year-old who Larry saw swimming in the wrong direction, was found fairly far down the eastern tunnel, laying on a rocky outcropping. Glenn's 22-year-old brother, Stephen, was found just 50 feet from the entrance of the shaft, but it's believed he died at a much lower depth and then floated up to that position. Glenn's 19-year-old sister, Christine, and the 28-year-old man, Robert, that she was with inside of the false dome, were found embracing each other just under the false dome inside of the tunnel. Investigators believe when they were in there, they couldn't find the exit, and then realized that they had so little air that even if they found the exit, they would not get out in time. And so, knowing they were just minutes away from death, they abandoned looking for the exit and instead just embraced each other while they died. And then afterwards, their bodies floated down and out of the false dome. After this tragedy, the shaft was permanently closed to all divers, but years later, they would reopen it, a silent monument to the day that the darkness took 4 lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. At 12:30 inches the morning on the 9th of August, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was fast asleep in his bedroom next to his wife. They were at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when the sharp ring of his cell phone cut through the silence and woke him up. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, his eyes adjusting to the bright screen. He looked at the caller ID and saw it was his 6-year-old younger brother, Brandon. Kyle answered it, and before he could even get a word out, Brandon's panicked voice came through the speaker. He said he needed help, and then he immediately launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle he was driving north on Highway 277. Now, this is a really desolate two-lane country road that cuts through the vast, empty landscape of West Texas. There's not much out there. Brandon said that as he was driving, three men started chasing him. He was trying to get away, but his truck was just about to run out of gas. He was desperate. He wanted Kyle to drop everything right then in the middle of the night and come meet him. The plan was for Kyle to secretly hand off a can of gasoline so Brandon could fill up his truck and finally escape these three men who were after him. As Kyle listened to all of this, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't worried about three mysterious men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just immense annoyance. After hearing this frantic, bizarre story, Kyle was almost certain that there were no three men. He figured his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a powerful hallucination. He was in the middle of a substance-induced episode. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. He had managed to stay clean for about 6 months, and he'd been working really hard on himself. He was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children. But just 2 days before this late-night call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. Instead, he tried to talk his brother down. He told Brandon, "Don't do it. You're clean, you're doing so well, don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that Brandon hadn't listened to his advice. And ever since that phone call, Brandon's behavior had been getting more and more erratic. Kyle was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped him, Brandon must have found drugs somewhere else. In fact, the whole reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this ungodly hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this from talking to his parents earlier in the evening. Brandon was supposed to be on his way to their parents' house to cool off for a while. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior. So, his presence on that specific road at that specific time already fit into a pattern of recent trouble. Knowing that his brother was very likely high, Kyle understood that trying to reason with him would be pointless. Telling him, "Brandon, those three men aren't real, you're just hallucinating, please go to our parents' house," would have been like talking to a brick wall. Brandon wouldn't have listened. So, Kyle decided to try a different approach. He just focused on trying to calm his brother down over the phone. He wasn't thinking Brandon was in any real physical danger from other people. The only danger was from Brandon himself. But as Kyle tried to soothe him, Brandon didn't calm down at all. He just got more and more worked up, his voice growing more anxious as he kept talking about these three men who he said were gaining on him. Finally, Kyle just couldn't take it anymore and asked him straight up, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high. He just kept begging Kyle, pleading with him to please come help him, to hurry up before these men caught him. "Come give me the gas I need so I can escape. Please, man, you have to hurry." At this point, Kyle felt like there was no use in even talking to Brandon anymore. A part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. This was all just so crazy. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He shouldn't have to be babysitting his younger brother who was making these terrible choices. But at the same time, despite everything, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even though he was frustrated and resented being put in this position, he loved Brandon very much. And even though he truly believed there was no imminent danger from these phantom men, he decided he had to do something. He thought, you know what? I'm just going to go out there. I'll drive out to Highway 277, I'll find Brandon, and I'll just get him home safely. So, he told Brandon he would be right there, and then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark stretch of Highway 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. Kyle's wife hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother in such a volatile state. She had insisted that she and their son come along for support. So, as Kyle drove down the empty road, he scanned the darkness on either side, looking for any sign of Brandon's truck. To really paint a picture for you, this highway is the definition of desolate. There was no other traffic out there. In every direction, it was just wide open plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small, scraggly trees. It's a vast, empty area. Even at night, your headlights can cut through the darkness and you can see for a very long way ahead of you. Kyle had a great view of the road, but he couldn't see any other vehicles. There was no truck, no cars, nothing at all. His brother was nowhere in sight. But Kyle just kept driving, his eyes peering into the darkness, scanning the fields just in case Brandon had maybe veered off the road somewhere. Given the state he was in, that seemed entirely possible. But after driving for a while longer, he finally saw it. Way up ahead, parked crookedly, half on the shoulder and half on the road itself, was a pickup truck. Its lights were off. It was just sitting there, silent. The engine wasn't even idling, it was completely turned off. As Kyle got closer, he recognized it. It was Brandon's truck. So, he had found him. Or at least, he'd found his truck. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her and his son to stay in the car while he went over to talk to Brandon. At this point, Kyle was fully expecting to find his brother sitting inside the truck, probably still high and waiting for him to show up. He also couldn't help but notice that there was nobody else around. No other cars, no sign of the three men that were supposedly chasing his brother. It just reinforced his belief that Brandon was sitting there, high as a kite, and that he was about to have a very difficult conversation to get him to go home. But when Kyle walked across the empty highway and got to the truck, he peered through the driver's side window, and there was nobody inside. The truck was completely empty. Brandon was gone. Kyle stood there for a moment, totally confused. This just didn't make any sense. On the entire drive out to the truck, while they were on Highway 277, Brandon had been calling Kyle's phone repeatedly, over and over and over again. He kept saying things like, "Come on, you've got to hurry up. You have to get here. They're gaining on me. I'm in real trouble. Bring that gasoline. You've got to get here now." And now, Kyle was finally here. He had reached Brandon's truck. It was right there in front of him. But Brandon himself had vanished. He hadn't said anything on the phone about leaving his truck. So where was he? What was going on? Kyle started looking around, getting more and more confused. He looked under the vehicle. He opened the doors and searched the inside of the truck for his brother, which felt completely absurd. Why would his brother be hiding in his own truck? But as he was searching the truck and scanning the dark fields around him, Kyle's phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, who was now feeling incredibly annoyed and exasperated, answered the phone. He said, "Brandon, where are you?" And Brandon's voice came back, calm as ever, "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle shot back, "No, you're not. I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here, but you're not." But just then, Kyle looked up and saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards him. As the car got closer, he realized it was a police car. So, he's standing there on the phone with his missing brother, watching a cop car approach and clearly slow down, as if the officer was planning to stop and talk to him. And as this was happening, with the cop car pulling up right in front of him, Brandon said something on the phone that made Kyle's blood run cold. He said, "Run away from that cop." Now, think about that for a second. That statement meant that Brandon had to be somewhere nearby. He could obviously see the cop car approaching Kyle. He was watching the whole scene unfold, even though Kyle couldn't see him at all. Kyle quickly tried to process this. He was thinking, where could Brandon possibly be? He looked out again at the landscape. It was just open fields on both sides of the highway. A barren, flat wasteland in the middle of Texas. there was nowhere to hide. There were a couple of bigger shrubs and a few small trees way off in the distance, but really, there was no cover. So, where was Brandon? At this point, Kyle was just furious. He was confused, but mostly just angry. "What are you doing, Brandon?" He knew the reason his brother wanted him to run. It was because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a previous drug charge. So Brandon was just trying to protect himself, telling Kyle not to get involved with the police to keep him out of it. And Kyle was standing there, having driven all the way out into the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night to deal with this mess for his brother, who was clearly out of his mind. He was so annoyed. But again, what could he even do? He had absolutely no idea where Brandon was. Kyle was about to say something back to Brandon to demand that he tell him where he was and to come out, but just then Brandon hung up. By this point, the police officer had arrived. He parked his patrol car, got out, and walked over to Kyle, who was now just standing awkwardly next to his brother's abandoned truck. He had put his phone back in his pocket. When the officer got close, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call that had come in from a trucker who reported seeing a stranded driver on the side of the road. So he asked Kyle if that was him. He pointed to Brandon's truck and asked, "Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver?" But Kyle said no, it wasn't his truck. It belonged to his brother. And despite how much he just wanted to tell the deputy the whole messy truth, he felt he had to protect his brother. So he couldn't tell the deputy that his brother had left his car here because he was probably high on meth and was hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and oh, by the way, he also has a warrant out for his arrest. Instead, Kyle made up a story on the spot. He said, "Well, I think he went off to get some gas. He called me and said he'd run out, so he parked his car here. He probably just started walking down the road. I just got here myself." Then he asked the deputy, "Is it okay with you if I get back in my car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? I'm sure he's fine, but he did call me for help with gas. So, do you mind if I go look for him?" And surprisingly, the deputy seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead." So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started the engine. He pulled away and drove farther down the highway away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror to see what the cop was doing. The deputy was just standing there, still parked next to Brandon's truck. Eventually, when Kyle had driven far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road again. He then began angrily calling his brother's phone over and over and over, trying to get him to pick up. But Brandon never answered any of the calls. So at this point, Kyle had no idea what was going on with his brother. He was completely out of contact. Kyle and his family sat there on the side of the dark highway for a little while longer, continuing to try and get in touch with Brandon, but it was no use. Eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son started crying and complaining. It was so late, and he was tired. Kyle's wife was exhausted too. It was now 2:00 in the morning, and Kyle was just completely over the whole situation. He thought to himself, "You know what? Brandon is a grown man. I tried to come out here and help him get out of this mess, but if he doesn't want to talk to me and he wants to hide out on the side of a highway, then that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home." And so that's exactly what he did. He turned the car around and drove right back the way he came. On his way, he passed by his brother's truck again, which was still there on the side of the road. This meant Brandon was clearly still hiding somewhere nearby. And standing next to the truck was still Deputy Neal, presumably waiting for Brandon to show back up. Kyle just drove right past them without stopping, went back to his home in San Angelo, and he and his family went to bed. He figured that tomorrow he would probably hear from Brandon, who would have some crazy story to explain what had really happened. But whatever it was, Kyle decided that was Brandon's problem to deal with. Not long after Kyle had driven past him on his way home, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just sit there all night waiting for Brandon to return. He had already done a quick search of Brandon's truck and found nothing particularly concerning inside. There was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were all things that someone would typically take with them if they had run out of gas and decided to walk to find help. So, the story Kyle had told him seemed to check out. It really did look like Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and started walking. Then his brother showed up, and now the whole situation was playing out. So, Deputy Neal figured he had other, more pressing calls to get to. It didn't seem like this was a major emergency. He reached inside Brandon's truck, turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them securely. After that, he got back in his own patrol car, and he took off to attend to his other duties for the night. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277. He just wanted to check and make sure that Brandon had eventually come back and picked up his truck. But when he arrived, the truck was still sitting there, right where he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. At this point, Deputy Neal started to get a bit concerned about Brandon. If he was out on foot walking to get gas, even though the initial risk seemed low, it was possible that something could have happened to him that might explain why he hadn't come back for his truck yet. Maybe he was hit by a car, or maybe he got lost in the dark. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or maybe Brandon had just decided not to get his truck yet. Maybe he had gotten a ride home and was planning to come back for it later. Regardless, it just seemed like Deputy Neal really needed to follow up with Brandon in person just to make sure that he was okay. So, Neal drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could look up Brandon's contact information. But when he walked in the door, he didn't even have a chance to start digging. Another employee immediately told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had told them a very different story from the one that Brandon's brother Kyle had told Neal the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past couple of days, and last night, the night that his truck was found, Brandon was supposed to have been on his way to his parents' house to cool off after their argument. But he never arrived at his parents' house. And he never came back home to Ledessa's house either. Brandon was now totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with him. Everyone had been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. After hearing this new information, Deputy Neal was surprised and also pretty angry. It was clear that Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa was now telling this completely different and much more worrying story. So the very first thing Neal did was go and speak to Kyle again, and also to the rest of Brandon's family, to try and get the story straight. And it very quickly became clear to Deputy Neal that any omissions or even lies about what had happened on the night Brandon went missing were not because the family was trying to hide something sinister. Yes, they were trying to protect Brandon, but it was mostly because they didn't understand just how serious the situation really was. Now that it was clear Brandon was truly missing and nobody knew what had happened to him, the family was very open and honest. They told the police they really didn't know where he was, and that yes, it was possible he was on drugs, they just didn't know for sure. But the bottom line was, he was missing, and they needed the police to go and look for him. And so that's exactly what Deputy Neal did. Over the next 4 days, a huge search operation was launched. Neal led the effort, which was centered all around the spot on Highway 277 where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canine units, helicopters, and large ground search teams, some of which were equipped with thermal cameras that could detect body heat, they found nothing. Despite covering a vast area all around where Brandon had clearly been, there was absolutely no sign of him. They also spoke to all the homeowners and property owners in the general area to see if maybe they had seen something strange that night, maybe they had seen Brandon, or maybe even those 3 men that he claimed had been chasing him. But nobody had seen anything out of the ordinary. So basically, Brandon was definitely not in that area. And there was no evidence that he had been there other than his abandoned truck. That was the only thing they had. And so, Deputy Neal and the other authorities involved in the search eventually came to a conclusion. Based on the fact that Brandon had been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he hadn't been seen in days with no trace of him anywhere, they believed that Brandon had simply fled. He wasn't there because he had chosen not to be there. He was never in any real danger, he had just run away from his problems, and searching for him in that area was a waste of time. They basically just had to wait for Brandon to show up somewhere at some point in the future. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case of a man voluntarily disappearing. That is, until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a piece of information that changed everything. On the 13th of August, 2013, 4 days after Brandon went missing, and right around the time the official search had been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across his desk from Ledessa. She looked extremely upset. She explained that she had gotten so worried about Brandon that she had started looking through their shared cell phone records, and she had found something that was really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper from her purse and handed it to the officer, pointing to a specific section. The officer quickly realized he was looking at a printed copy of Brandon's call logs from the night he disappeared. And what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. In between a whole flurry of calls to his brother Kyle and to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 absolutely terrified her. She explained that Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid contact with the police. He was terrified of them. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even told him to run away from the police on the night he went missing when he saw Deputy Neal approaching. So she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But then she asked, why, after calling the police for help, did he then presumably run away from them? It just didn't make any sense at all. All of this came as a total surprise to the officer and to the entire sheriff's department. Up until that moment, their belief had been that a random trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver, and that was how Deputy Neal got involved in the first place. Nobody had any idea that there had been another separate 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch center in that area was very small, underfunded, and understaffed. It seems that at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball and failed to inform the sheriff's department about Brandon's call. They genuinely did not know about it. But now that they did, they absolutely needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department immediately contacted the 911 dispatch center, and they sent over an audio recording of Brandon's call. When the investigators listened to it, they were shocked. For one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent, life-threatening danger. This was not the low-stakes call of a stranded driver with car trouble. This was the sound of someone who believed they were in real peril. And secondly, if you listened very closely to the recording, you could hear the faint sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call shortly before the line went dead. The call went like this. The dispatcher says, 911 emergency. Brandon replies, yes, I'm in the middle of a field. We're just pushing guys over right here, going toward Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased to the woods pretty hard. The confused dispatcher says, okay, now run that by me. Brandon then says something that sounds like, we're not talking to him. I accidentally ran into him. The dispatcher asks, you ran into him. Okay. Brandon says, got the first guy. The dispatcher then asks, do you need an ambulance? Brandon replies, yeah. No, I need the cops. The dispatcher asks, okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? 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 And then the call cuts out. So at this point, the authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't seem like a simple disappearance anymore. This might be a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body, but the idea that there was another voice on the call and that Brandon was talking about being chased through the woods by these men This audio recording gave a huge amount of legitimacy to the story he had told his brother. And so the search, which had just been officially ended, was quickly resumed and dramatically expanded. For the next full year, with all these additional resources being poured into the effort, there was a massive, sustained search to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that stretch of Highway 277, all over the fields near where his truck was found. There was no evidence. He had vanished. And so, ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. For the most part, the authorities just had to move on to other cases. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ladessa, would go on to hire 2 separate private detectives. Both of them would conduct their own large-scale searches multiple times all around the area where Brandon left his truck and even in other parts of the state. But they, too, came up completely empty. And as the years passed by with no answers, Brandon's disappearance started to capture more and more public attention. It began to be featured on TV shows and podcasts. People came up with all kinds of theories about what might have happened. Maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere into the wilderness and was attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by those 3 men, and they had kidnapped or killed him. And maybe that other voice you can hear on the 911 recording belonged to one of those men. Or maybe he really had just successfully fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department had originally thought. Nobody really knew for sure. And so, for 9 long years, Brandon's case remained full of questions and had 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277, to the very area where Brandon had disappeared 9 years earlier, an area which had been searched so many times over the years. And this small group of volunteers would end up making the single biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were meticulously combing through a field right off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Very quickly, a team of deputies arrived, cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that very same field, not far from where the shorts and shoes were found, they discovered a fragment of a human skull. DNA testing was performed, and it confirmed that the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would finally answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually, it just made the whole thing even more baffling. Because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near where his truck had been parked. It was an area that had been searched so many times, with thermal cameras and trained canines and helicopters and hundreds of human searchers. And for 9 years, nobody had found it. Remember, this area off the side of the highway is not some thick, dense forest. It is a huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass, short cactus plants, and a few scattered trees. It is a very easy place to find things. Yet, this skull fragment was not found. Neither were the shorts or the shoes. It just seemed so completely improbable. So, where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is that despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, the canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, and the hundreds of volunteers and professional searchers that combed this specific area for years, they all just somehow missed a grown man wearing bright white sneakers lying in a barren strip of West Texas where it is incredibly easy to see anything. That's option 1. Or option 2, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were all looking for him. He was somewhere else entirely. But if you believe option 2, the question then becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he all that time? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? And even if you could answer that, How did his skull fragment and his clothes end up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound and unsettling mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still do not have a good answer. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.